September 2nd, 1864. The humidity in Valdosta, Georgia, pressed down on the earth with a physical weight, clinging to the skin like a wet sheet. 13-year-old John Henry Holliday sat on the warping wood of his family's porch, his back stiff against the peeling white paint of the siding. The air smelled of burning pine and the stale copper odor of distant violence. The Civil War was not a glorious crusade in this corner of the South. It was a slow, grinding erosion of everything solid. Refugees from the North trudged past the Holliday estate, their boots kicking up clouds of red Georgia clay that coated their rags in a uniform layer of rust. John Henry watched them with eyes that were already too old for his smooth, boyish face. He observed the hollows of their cheeks, the tremors in their hands, and the way they looked at the house with a mixture of envy and hatred. His father, Major Henry Holliday, spoke often of honor and heritage, but John Henry saw only the rot. The war was eating the country alive, stripping the meat from the bone until only the skeleton remained. The true horror, however, was not out on the road, but inside the house. The Holliday home, once a sanctuary of Southern refinement, had transformed into a sterile waiting room for death. John Henry rose from the porch and walked inside, the floorboards creaking under his boots. The curtains were drawn tight to block out the harsh sun, creating a perpetual twilight in the hallways. He walked toward his mother's bedroom, the silence of the house broken only by the wet, ragged sound of coughing. Alice Jane McKee Holliday was dying. The disease was consumption, a slow-moving predator that dissolved the lungs and drowned the victim in their own fluids. John Henry pushed the door open and stepped into the sick room. The smell hit him first, a cloying mixture of medicinal camphor, stale sweat, and the metallic tang of fresh blood. He sat in the wooden chair beside the bed, his movements precise and quiet. His mother lay propped up against a mountain of pillows, her skin translucent and stretched tight over the sharp angles of her skull. She looked less like the vibrant woman who had raised him and more like a wax figure melting in the heat. John Henry took a cloth from the basin of cool water on the nightstand and wrung it out. He wiped her forehead, his hand steady. She opened her eyes, the whites yellowed and bloodshot, and looked at him with a terrifying desperation. She tried to speak, but the effort triggered a spasm in her chest. Her body convulsed, her back arching off the mattress as she hacked and retched. John Henry held the ceramic basin under her chin as she expelled a thick pink froth. He watched the blood splatter against the white porcelain, analyzing the volume, the color, the consistency. He did not look away. He could not. This was the reality of the world, a brutal biological struggle where the strong were eaten by the invisible weak. September 16th, 1866. The struggle ended. John Henry stood over the bed watching the final rise and fall of his mother's chest. The silence that followed was absolute. He waited for a miracle, for a sudden intake of breath, but there was only the stillness of a corpse. He reached out and touched her hand. It was already cooling, the warmth of life retreating inward. In that moment, the concept of a benevolent God died alongside Alice Holliday. John Henry looked around the room at the blood-stained linens, the empty medicine bottles, the useless Bible on the nightstand. He felt a cold, hard knot form in the center of his chest. He realized then that love was a liability. Attachment was a weakness that the universe would exploit to inflict maximum pain. He turned his back on the body and walked out of the room, leaving his childhood behind in the stench of the sick room. 4 years passed, filled with a rigid, angry discipline. John Henry threw himself into his studies, seeking to master the physical world that had betrayed him. In 1870, he boarded a train north, leaving the ruins of the South for the industrial grime of Philadelphia. He enrolled in the Pennsylvania College of Dental Surgery, a decision driven not by a desire to heal, but by a fascination with the mechanics of the body. The city was a shock to his system. It was loud, crowded, and filthy, the air thick with coal smoke and the stench of horse manure. He found a room in a boarding house on Spruce Street, a narrow, drafty space that smelled of boiled cabbage and damp wool. He arranged his books on the small desk. Gray's Anatomy, manuals on oral surgery, chemistry texts. He lived like a monk, his existence defined by the lecture hall and the laboratory. The dental college was a grim theater of gore. The students gathered in the amphitheater to watch the professors demonstrate extractions and surgeries. There was no anesthesia for the poor souls who came to the clinic, only whiskey and restraint straps. John Henry watched as the instructors clamped cold steel pliers onto rotted molars, the patients screaming as the tooth was wrenched from the jawbone with a sickening crack. He saw gums sliced open to drain abscesses, the pus flowing freely. He saw jaws wired shut, tongues excised for cancer, faces reconstructed after industrial accidents. He did not flinch. He absorbed it all, his mind cataloging the fragility of human tissue. He learned that the body was just a machine, a collection of pulleys and levers that could be broken, repaired, or discarded. He excelled in his coursework, his hands discovering a natural talent for the delicate work of gold foil fillings and bridge construction. He was the top of his class, a cold, brilliant young man who spoke little and smiled even less. March 1st, 1872. John Henry stood on the stage at the Musical Fund Hall, the diploma in his hand confirming him as a doctor of dental surgery. He was 20 years old. He looked the part of a gentleman. A tailored black suit, a silk cravat, his blonde hair neatly parted. But his eyes were hard, lacking the warmth of youth. He returned to the South, first to St. Louis where he worked briefly, and then back to Atlanta to join the practice of Dr. Arthur Ford. The office was located on the second floor of a brick building overlooking the bustling street. It was a respectable place, filled with velvet chairs and the polite murmurs of wealthy patients. John Henry settled into the routine, drilling, filling, and extracting. He was good at it. The patients admired his handsome face and his gentle hands, unaware of the nihilism that festered behind his polite smile. The summer of 1872 brought a heat wave that turned Atlanta into a furnace. The air was stagnant, heavy with pollen and dust. John Henry began to feel a familiar fatigue, a deep, bone-weary exhaustion that sleep could not touch. He dismissed it as overwork. He ignored the night sweats that left his sheets sodden. He ignored the loss of appetite, the way his clothes began to hang loosely on his frame. Then came the cough. It started as a dry tickle, a nuisance that he suppressed with lozenges and water. But it grew worse. It became a hacking, violent thing that seized him at the most inopportune times. He would have to step away from a patient, his body shaking as he fought to clear his lungs. He felt a tightness in his chest, a constant dull ache that made every breath a labor. One afternoon in 1873, the truth made itself known. John Henry was alone in the office polishing a set of dentures. A coughing fit hit him with the force of a physical blow. He bent over the sink, his hands gripping the porcelain rim until his knuckles turned white. He coughed until he gagged, his vision swimming with black spots. Then he felt a warm, wet sensation in his mouth. He spat into the white basin, bright red blood bloomed against the porcelain, swirling in the saliva. He stared at it, the polishing wheel still spinning behind him with a low hum. It was the same red he had seen in his mother's basin, the same red that had signaled the end of her life. He wiped his mouth with the back of his hand and looked at the smear of crimson on his skin. He did not feel panic. He felt a grim sense of confirmation. The hereditary curse had come for him. He sought out Dr. Rasmussen, the most renowned lung specialist in the city. The examination was a cold, clinical affair. John Henry sat on the leather table, stripped to the waist, his ribs showing clearly against his pale skin. The doctor pressed a stethoscope to his chest, listening to the rattles and wheezes of his failing lungs. He tapped on John Henry's back, the sound dull and flat where there should have been resonance. He measured his chest expansion, his temperature, his pulse. When the examination was over, Rasmussen sat behind his desk and cleaned, his spectacles avoiding John Henry's gaze. The diagnosis was pulmonary tuberculosis. The prognosis was terminal. The doctor explained that the humidity of Georgia was accelerating the disease. His lungs were being eaten away. If he stayed, he would be dead within months. John Henry listened to the sentence being passed. He asked about treatments, about cures. Rasmussen shook his head. There was no cure. The only hope for prolonging his life, for buying a few more years of existence, was a radical change in climate. He needed dry air. He needed the high desert. Texas, perhaps, or the territories further west. The doctor spoke of the restorative properties of the dry air, but his voice lacked conviction. They both knew the truth. John Henry was a dead man. The only question was how long it would take for him to lie down. John Henry buttoned his shirt, his fingers numb. He paid the doctor and walked out into the street. The noise of the city seemed distant, muffled by the ringing in his ears. He looked at the people passing by, businessmen, mothers with children, laborers. They all had futures. They made plans for next year, for 10 years from now. John Henry had no future. He had only the present and a shrinking supply of breaths. He returned to his office and began to pack. He did not pack with the care of a man moving to a new home. He packed with the ruthless efficiency of a soldier retreating from a lost position. He took his dental instruments, the steel tools of a trade he would likely never practice again. He took his clothes, his few books, and a heavy, dark revolver he had purchased years ago but never fired. He looked around the office one last time, at the framed diploma on the wall. It was a lie, a piece of paper promising a life he would never live. He left it there, hanging crookedly on the nail. He went to the train station that very evening, purchasing a one-way ticket to Dallas, Texas. He did not tell his friends. He did not say goodbye to the few family members who remained. He simply vanished. The train ride west was a descent into hell. The carriage was crowded with migrants, the air thick with the smell of unwashed bodies, tobacco smoke, and coal dust. John Henry sat by the window, isolating himself from the other passengers. He coughed into a handkerchief, hiding the blood, his eyes fixed on the changing landscape. The lush green forests of the south gave way to the rolling plains, the trees thinning out, the grass turning brown and brittle. The air grew hotter, drier. The train rattled and shook, every jolt sending a spike of pain through his chest. He watched the sun set over the Mississippi River, a blood-red orb sinking into the dark water. He felt a kinship with the setting sun. He was going down, sinking into the dark, and there was no rising again. He arrived in Dallas in late 1873. The town was a shock after the established cities of the East. It was a raw, dusty scar on the prairie, a collection of wooden buildings thrown up in haste. The streets were unpaved, turning to mud when it rained and choking dust when it didn't. Pigs and stray dogs roamed freely. Men walked with pistols on their hips and violence in their eyes. John Henry stepped off the train, his boots sinking into the dirt. The dry air hit his throat like sandpaper, but he breathed it in deep, testing the doctor's theory. It didn't feel healing. It just felt harsh. He found a room in a boarding house near the center of town. The walls were paper-thin, allowing the sounds of the saloon next door to drift in, shouting, glass breaking, the tinny sound of a piano. He tried to establish a practice. He rented a small room above a general store, hung out his shingle, and waited. A few patients came, Desperate souls with swollen jaws and blackened teeth. John Henry worked on them, his hands still steady, but the coughing fits were impossible to hide. He would turn away, hacking into his sleeve, his body convulsing. The patients looked at him with fear. They knew what that cough meant. It was the sound of the plague. Word spread quickly. The new dentist was a lunger. He was dying. To go to him was to risk catching the death. The trickle of patients dried up. John Henry sat in his empty office, staring at the dust motes dancing in the shafts of sunlight. The rejection did not hurt his feelings, it hardened his resolve. Society had rejected him because he was broken. Very well. He would reject society. He began to spend his days and nights in the saloons. The gambling halls of Dallas were a different world, a meritocracy of luck and nerve. No one cared about his cough as long as his money was good. He sat at the faro tables watching the cards turn. He had a mind built for patterns, for probabilities. He studied the game with the same intensity he had applied to anatomy. He learned the odds of every draw, the tells of the dealers, the subtle shifts in the atmosphere that signaled a cheat. He started winning. Small amounts at first, then larger. The stack of coins in front of him grew. He realized that gambling was the only honest profession left. It was a direct confrontation with fate. You put your money down, you took your risk, and you accepted the outcome. There was no pretense of fairness, no promise of a long life. He drank heavily. The whiskey burned his throat, cauterizing the urge to cough. It dulled the fear that lived in the back of his mind, the constant awareness of the bacteria eating his lungs. He found that when he was drunk, he didn't care about dying. In fact, he welcomed the idea. Death was no longer a tragedy, it was a release. He began to carry his revolver not in his bag, but on his person. He practiced drawing it in his room, the motion becoming fluid and automatic. He watched the rough men in the saloons, the cowboys, the teamsters, the drifters. They postured and threatened, using violence to establish dominance. John Henry looked at them with a cold, dead stare. They were afraid of dying. He could see it in their eyes. He was not. That made him dangerous. That made him free. The transformation was taking hold. The gentleman from Georgia was shedding his skin. The manners, the education, the refined sensibilities. They were all useless armor in this new war. He needed to be harder, sharper, crueler. He stopped wearing the cravats. He let his mustache grow thick and long, hiding the thinness of his lips. He bought a long gray coat that concealed the pistol at his hip. He walked with a new gait, a slow, deliberate stride that conserved his energy. He was 22 years old, but he felt ancient. He was a walking corpse, a dead man playing cards with the living, waiting for the moment when the game would turn violent. One night, sitting at a table in the back of a smoky saloon, he caught a man dealing from the bottom of the deck. In his former life, John Henry would have alerted the authorities or simply left the game. Now he felt a surge of cold rage. He reached out and clamped his hand over the dealer's wrist, pinning the cards to the felt. The music in the room stopped. The other players froze. The dealer, a man with a scar across his nose and a knife in his boot, looked at the frail dentist with contempt. He snarled a threat, reaching for his weapon. John Henry didn't flinch. He didn't blink. He just stared at the man with eyes that had seen the inside of a dissecting room, eyes that had watched his mother drown in her own blood. He coughed, a wet, rattling sound, and then spoke in a voice that was barely a whisper but carried the weight of a tombstone. The dealer hesitated. He saw something in John Henry's face that terrified him. It was the absolute absence of fear. The dealer pulled his hand back, leaving the money on the table. John Henry raked the pot towards him, his pale fingers closing over the coins. The game continued. The die was cast. John Henry Holliday had arrived in the West, and he had brought his graveyard with him. January 1st, 1875. The new year in Dallas, Texas arrived not with the pristine silence of winter snow, but with the raucous explosion of gunfire and the drunken roars of men celebrating their survival for another 12 months. The sun beat down on the unpaved streets, baking the mud into a hard, cracked surface that resembled the skin of a reptile. John Henry Holliday sat on the edge of his bed in a boarding house room that smelled of stale tobacco smoke and the metallic residue of his own coughing fits. The morning light sliced through the gaps in the curtains, illuminating the dust motes that danced in the stagnant air. He swung his legs over the side of the mattress, his feet finding the rough wood of the floor. His chest felt tight, a band of iron restricting his ribs, a constant reminder of the bacilli multiplying within his lungs. He reached for the bottle of whiskey on the nightstand, uncorking it with a practiced twist of his wrist. He took a long, burning pull, the amber liquid coating his throat and numbing the urge to hack. This was his breakfast. This was his medicine. He dressed with the methodical slowness of a man who had nowhere to be and no one to see. He pulled on a fresh white shirt, the starch stiff against his skin, and buttoned his vest. He tied his cravat, checking the knot in the cracked mirror above the wash basin. The face staring back was gaunt, the cheekbones sharp enough to cut, the skin pale despite the Texas sun. But the eyes were alive. They burned with a cold blue fire, a mixture of intelligence and a total lack of concern for the future. He strapped his gun belt around his waist, the leather worn and supple. The holster held a Navy Colt, a heavy piece of machinery that he kept oiled and loaded. He checked the cylinder, ensuring 6 rounds sat ready in the chambers. In the civilized world, carrying a weapon to breakfast was an absurdity. In Dallas, it was a necessity of life, as essential as boots or trousers. John Henry stepped out onto the street, the noise of the town washing over him. Dallas was a hive of activity, a boomtown fueled by the railroad and the cattle trade. Wagons rattled past, their wheels churning up clouds of red dust that coated the storefronts. Men shouted and cursed, driving teams of oxen or arguing over the price of lumber. John Henry walked through the chaos like a ghost, his boots making a distinct rhythmic sound on the boardwalk. He headed for the St. Charles Hotel, the establishment where the action was thickest and the whiskey was passable. He was no longer just a dentist who gambled. He was a gambler who occasionally pulled teeth. The transition was complete. He made his living reading the faces of strangers, calculating odds and taking money from men who thought luck was on their side. The saloon inside the St. Charles was a cavernous room filled with smoke and the murmur of low conversations. The air was thick with the smell of spilled beer, unwashed bodies, and the distinct acrid scent of nervous sweat. John Henry took his usual seat at a faro table, nodding to the dealer. He placed his money on the layout, a stack of gold coins that represented his entire net worth. He did not play for amusement. He played for survival. Every hand was a battle, every card turned a skirmish. He watched the other players, noting the twitch of a lip, the trembling of a hand, the dilation of pupils. He saw their fear. They were afraid of losing their money, afraid of being humiliated, afraid of the violence that always simmered just below the surface of the game. John Henry felt none of it. He had already lost the only wager of consequence: his life. Throughout the afternoon, the saloon filled with revelers celebrating the holiday. The noise level rose, a cacophony of shouts, laughter, and the clinking of glass. Among the crowd was Charles Austin, a prominent saloon keeper in Dallas. Austin was a man accustomed to respect, a figure of authority in the rough hierarchy of the town. He moved through the room with a swagger, greeting friends and eyeing the gambling tables with a proprietary air. There was a history of friction between Austin and Holliday. It was the natural antagonism between two different species of predator. Austin was a man of the town, invested in its growth and order, albeit a rough sort of order. Holliday was a drifter, a parasitic entity that fed on the town's vices and offered nothing in return but cold stares and sharp words. They had exchanged insults before, veiled threats wrapped in polite conversation. As the afternoon wore on, the tension in the room began to thicken. The alcohol flowed freely, loosening tongues and lowering inhibitions. Austin approached the table where Holliday sat. The saloon keeper had been drinking, his face flushed, his eyes glassy and aggressive. He made a comment about Holliday's game, a disparaging remark about the legitimacy of the deal. It was a direct insult, a challenge thrown down in front of a dozen witnesses. In the code of the West, such an insult could not go unanswered. To ignore it was to admit weakness, and in a town like Dallas, weakness was an invitation to be victimized. John Henry looked up from his cards. He did not stand. He did not raise his voice. He simply looked at Austin with that terrifying, dead-eyed stare. He told Austin to mind his own affairs. The words were quiet, precise, cutting through the noise of the saloon like a razor. Austin bristled. He was not used to being dismissed by a consumptive dentist with a death rattle in his chest. The saloon keeper escalated the confrontation, his voice rising to a shout. He called Holliday a cheat, a vagrant, a man of no consequence. The other players at the table pulled back, sensing the shift in the atmosphere. The piano player in the corner stopped playing, leaving a sudden ringing silence in the room. Every eye turned to the confrontation. This was the theater of the frontier. The moment when posturing turned to violence. John Henry slowly placed his cards on the table, face down. He stood up. He was not a physically imposing man. He was thin, frail even, compared to the burly Austin. But there was a coiled energy in him, a kinetic potential that radiated danger. He coughed, a short, dry hack, and wiped his mouth. He told Austin that the conversation was over. Austin, fueled by whiskey and pride, reached for the pistol tucked into his waistband. It was a clumsy move, telegraphed by anger. John Henry did not hesitate. He did not think. His hand moved with the speed of a striking snake, sweeping back the tail of his coat and finding the handle of his Navy Colt. The sound of the shot was deafening in the confined space. It was not a pop, but a roar, a thunderclap that shook the floorboards. Smoke erupted from the barrel of Holliday's gun, a gray cloud that instantly obscured his vision. He did not wait to see the result. He cocked the hammer and fired again. The heavy recoil jarred his arm, traveling up his shoulder to his neck. He felt the mechanical action of the revolver, the cylinder rotating, the hammer falling, the primer igniting the powder. It was a process of pure physics, distinct and undeniable. Austin staggered back, the first ball having missed him by inches, splintering the wood of the bar behind him. The second shot went wild as bystanders dove for cover, overturning tables and scattering coins across the floor. It was chaos. Men screamed and scrambled for the exits. The air filled with the acrid stench of burnt gunpowder, a smell that John Henry found strangely clarifying. He stood his ground, the pistol leveled, his heart hammering against his ribs, not from fear but from the exertion. Austin, realizing he was outmatched in speed, if not in firepower, retreated, stumbling over a chair. He did not return fire. The aggression drained out of him the moment the first slug tore past his ear. He had expected the dentist to cower. He had not expected the dentist to open fire with the intent to kill. The town marshal and his deputies burst through the doors a moment later, weapons drawn. They found Holliday standing amidst the wreckage of the game, his gun still in his hand, smoke drifting from the barrel. He did not resist. He did not try to run. He simply lowered the hammer of his revolver and placed it on the bar. He looked at the lawmen with a look of mild annoyance, as if they had interrupted a pleasant conversation. They took him into custody, marching him out of the saloon and into the bright, harsh sunlight of the street. A crowd had gathered, drawn by the sound of gunfire. They stared at the slim figure in the black coat, whispering among themselves. This was the dentist. This was the man who was supposed to be pulling teeth. They threw him in the Dallas jail, a dark, damp cell that smelled of urine and despair. John Henry sat on the narrow cot listening to the shouts of the other prisoners. He was not afraid of the law. What could they do to him? Hang him? Imprison him? It all led to the same end. The tuberculosis was a slow executioner. The hangman was a fast one. He coughed into the darkness, the sound echoing off the stone walls. He felt a strange sense of satisfaction. He had faced a man who wanted to harm him, and he had not blinked. He had asserted his right to exist, to take up space, to demand respect. The veneer of civilization had cracked, and he found he preferred the jagged edges beneath. The legal proceedings were a farce. Austin, though shaken, was not dead. No blood had actually been spilled on the floor, only dignity. The charge was assault with intent to murder, but in Dallas such charges were often negotiable. Friends of Holliday, fellow gamblers who respected his nerve, pooled their resources. Or perhaps the town simply didn't want the expense of a trial for a dispute where no one died. Bail was set. Money changed hands. The mechanics of the justice system were just another game of chance, subject to the same rules of influence and gold as the faro table. John Henry walked out of the jail a few days later. The air outside tasted sweet despite the dust. He knew he could not stay in Dallas. The heat was too much in every sense of the word. Austin had friends, and the law would be watching him closely now. He packed his few belongings in his boarding house room. The dental instruments went into the bag, but they were buried deeper now, beneath the decks of cards and the boxes of ammunition. He checked his revolver, cleaning the soot from the barrel and reloading the empty chambers. He was a marked man now. He had crossed a line. He was no longer a civilian. He was a gunman. He boarded a train bound for Denison, Texas, a rougher, wilder town near the border of Indian Territory. As the train chugged north, leaving the skyline of Dallas behind, John Henry watched the telegraph poles whip past the window. He felt a vibration in the floorboards, the rhythm of the wheels on the steel tracks. He was moving deeper into the frontier, deeper into the anarchy. He touched the handle of the gun beneath his coat. It was cold, hard, and real. It was the only friend he could trust. The incident with Austin had taught him a valuable lesson. The world respected violence. It did not respect degrees or good manners or a tragic diagnosis. It respected the man who was willing to pull the trigger first. Denison was a town of vice, a gateway to the lawless lands across the Red River. It was a place where U.S. Marshals feared to tread after dark, where the saloons never closed and the brothels did a brisk trade. John Henry stepped off the train into the mud of Main Street. He looked at the faces of the men loitering on the corners. They were hard men, outlaws, and fugitives. He fit right in. He found a room, unpacked his bag, and headed for the nearest game. He was John Henry Holliday, the man who had shot up the St. Charles. The reputation preceded him, a whisper in the gambling halls. Men looked at him differently now. They saw the illness in his face, yes, but they also saw the steel. They gave him a wide berth. He sat at a table, shuffling a deck of cards. His hands were pale and elegant, the fingers long and dexterous. He dealt the cards, the pasteboard snapping against the felt. He won, and he lost. He drank whiskey to dull the pain in his chest. He coughed until he tasted copper. But he was alive. He was living on his own terms, defying the death sentence that hung over his head. The shooting in Dallas was not an aberration. It was a beginning. It was the moment he decided that if he was going to burn out, he would burn hot and bright, leaving a scar on the world that would not fade. The winter of 1875 turned into spring. John Henry drifted between the towns of northern Texas, a phantom moving through the smoke of the saloons. He had more skirmishes, more arguments. He was quick to take offense, quick to reach for his weapon. He was a man with a short fuse and a large supply of powder. The fear of death had been cauterized in that Dallas saloon. He walked with the confidence of a man who held the aces. He knew the game was rigged. He knew the house always won in the end. But while he was at the table, he was going to play the hand he was dealt, and he was going to play it aggressively. The first blood in Dallas had been a missed shot, a warning across the bow of his destiny. The next time, he knew, his aim would be true. The next time, the ball of metal would find its mark. He looked at his reflection in the bottom of a whiskey glass. He saw a killer looking back. He smiled, a thin, grim curving of his lips. He raised the glass and toasted the empty room. To Dallas, to Charles Austin, to the long, dark road ahead. He drank the whiskey down, slamming the glass onto the table. The game continued. February 3rd, 1876. The air in Denver, Colorado was not merely cold. It was a physical assault on the body, a razor-sharp entity that sliced through wool coats and settled deep into the marrow of the bone. John Henry Holliday stood on the corner of Blake Street, the wind whipping his long coat around his legs. The altitude here was over 5,000 feet, a mile closer to the sky than where he had been born. The doctors had claimed the thin, dry air would help his lungs, would dry out the pockets of fluid that plagued him. They were wrong. The air here was so thin it felt as if he were starving for oxygen with every breath. He inhaled, and the cold burned its way down his trachea, seizing his chest in a rigid grip of ice. He coughed, a harsh barking sound that drew glances from the passers-by. He pulled a handkerchief from his pocket and pressed it to his lips, catching the phlegm before it could freeze on his chin. It was streaked with pink, a grim splash of color, against the gray backdrop of the winter city. He had left Texas behind, trading the dusty heat for the frozen Rockies. Texas had become too hot in a legal sense, the incident with Austin marking him as a man to be watched. He had drifted north, following the rail lines and the rumors of gold, landing in Denver just as the city was trying to shed its rough frontier skin for a veneer of respectability. John Henry had no interest in respectability. He had tried that life in Atlanta and it had tasted like ashes. He walked into the Babbitt House, a gambling hall that catered to the transient population of miners, speculators, and teamsters. The warmth inside hit him like a physical blow, carrying the scent of coal smoke, stale beer, and unwashed bodies. He moved to the faro table, his movements precise and economical. He was known here as Doc now, a nickname that clung to him like a burr. It was a title of irony in these circles, a reminder of the healing profession he had abandoned for the profession of taking. He took his seat at the dealer's box, his pale hands shuffling the deck with a fluid, hypnotic rhythm. The cards were his tools now, replacing the dental drill and the extraction forceps. He dealt to a table of rough men, their faces weathered by the sun and wind, their hands calloused from swinging picks and driving mules. They looked at him with a mixture of curiosity and wariness. He was a creature they did not understand. A man who dressed like a funeral director, coughed like a dying consumptive, and handled a deck of cards with the lethal grace of a magician. The game began, the chips clicking against the felt. John Henry watched the board, his mind tracking the cases, the splits, the odds. He played with a cold detachment, winning not because he was lucky, but because he did not care if he lost. The trouble started 3 weeks later, on a night when the wind howled outside like a banshee. A local tough named Bud Ryan sat at the table losing, steadily. Ryan was a man of significant bulk and minimal intelligence, a dangerous combination when fueled by cheap whiskey. He began to mutter curses, directing his ire at the dealer. John Henry ignored him, his face a mask of boredom. He turned the cards, revealing a queen and a 7. Ryan lost again. The big man slammed his fist onto the table, the impact jumping the chips in their stacks. He accused Holliday of rigging the box, of slipping cards from the bottom. It was the standard accusation of a loser, dull and predictable. John Henry looked up, his blue eyes flat and unimpressed. He told Ryan to step away from the table if he did not know how to play the game. Ryan roared, a sound of pure animal aggression, and lunged across the felt. He did not go for a gun, he went for a knife, pulling a heavy Bowie blade from a sheath at his belt. The steel flashed in the lamplight, a glittering arc of death aimed at Holliday's chest. John Henry did not panic. Panic was a reaction to the unexpected, and he expected violence everywhere. He did not reach for the revolver under his coat. The distance was too short, the time too brief. Instead, his hand dropped to his boot. He came up with his own knife, a slim, wicked blade he kept razor sharp. He did not block Ryan's strike. He stepped inside it, his body twisting with a serpentine fluidity. He drove his blade upward, aiming for the soft tissue under the jaw or the armpit. The steel bit deep. It was not a clean cinematic duel. It was a messy, brutal collision of flesh and metal. Ryan grunted, his momentum carrying him forward, crashing into the table. John Henry stepped back, blood slicking his hand. Ryan clutched at his neck, the blood pumping between his fingers in dark, rhythmic spurts. The saloon went silent. Men stared at the frail dentist who stood wiping his blade on a dedicated rag he kept in his pocket. Ryan collapsed to the floor, his breathing turning into a wet gurgle. John Henry looked down at him, not with triumph, but with a clinical assessment of the wound. The jugular was cut, not fully severed. The man was dead. His body just hadn't finished the paperwork yet. John Henry sheathed his knife, gathered his winnings, and walked out the back door into the freezing night. He did not run. He simply evaporated into the darkness, leaving the chaos for someone else to clean up. He moved north again, driven by the law and the restlessness in his blood. He passed through Cheyenne, Wyoming, a town that sat on the high plains like a fortress against the wind. It was a hard place, a junction for the Union Pacific Railroad and a jumping-off point for the Black Hills. The gold rush was in full swing. Rumors of nuggets the size of hen's eggs in the Dakota Territory had set the world on fire. Men were pouring into Cheyenne by the trainload, buying supplies, horses, and wagons for the journey north to Deadwood. John Henry watched them with a cynical eye. They were sheep rushing to the slaughter, blinded by greed. He had no gold fever. He knew the real money was not in the ground, but in the pockets of the fools digging for it. He would go where the money was. The journey to Deadwood was a grueling test of endurance. He secured a seat on a stagecoach, a rattling wooden box suspended on leather straps that magnified every bump in the trail. The road was a rutted scar across the prairie, winding through the vast, empty landscape of Wyoming and up into the pine-covered hills of the Dakota Territory. The dust was omnipresent, coating his throat and aggravating his cough. Banditry was a constant threat. The coach drivers carried shotguns across their laps, their eyes scanning the ridges for road agents or hostile Sioux. John Henry sat inside, his revolver loose in its holster. He felt every jolt in his aching joints. The consumption made him sensitive to the cold, and the nights on the trail were frigid. He wrapped himself in a buffalo robe, listening to the wolves howl in the distance, waiting for the sun to rise and bring a meager warmth. They arrived in Deadwood Gulch in the late spring of 1876. It was not a town, it was a festering wound in the earth swarming with infection. The main street was a river of mud churned into a brown slurry by thousands of hooves and wagon wheels. Tents and shacks climbed the steep sides of the gulch, clinging to the slopes like barnacles. The noise was deafening. The ring of hammers, the shout of mule skinners, the constant low roar of men pursuing wealth. There was no law here. Deadwood was technically on Indian land, illegal territory under the Treaty of Fort Laramie. The United States government had no jurisdiction. It was a pirate kingdom, a sanctuary for every murderer, thief, and grifter in the West. John Henry stepped off the stagecoach and looked around. He smiled. It was perfect. He found a room in a boarding house that was little more than a canvas tent with a wooden floor. The dampness was pervasive, seeping into his bedding and his clothes. He set up shop in one of the many gambling halls that lined the street. These were not the velvet-draped salons of the East or even the sturdy saloons of Denver. These were rough, raw places with sawdust floors to soak up the tobacco spit and spilled whiskey. The air was blue with smoke, hanging in a thick cloud that stung the eyes. John Henry sat at the table, dealing faro to miners who still had the mud of the creek beds on their hands. He coughed, the sound lost in the din of the room. He drank the rot-gut whiskey they served, a vile liquid that tasted of kerosene and burnt sugar. It burned the bacteria, or so he told himself. Deadwood was a violent place. Arguments were settled with fists, knives, or pistols. Bodies were found in the alleyways every morning, stripped of their boots and gold dust. John Henry navigated this shark tank with ease. He was a shark himself, perhaps smaller than the others, but with sharper teeth. He forged a reputation quickly. Men learned that the skinny gambler with the cough was not to be trifled with. He had a temper that flared instantly and a willingness to escalate any conflict to lethal levels. He did not bluff in poker, and he did not bluff in life. If he put his hand on his gun, he intended to use it. This certainty terrified the blusterers and bullies who populated the camps. They were used to men who postured. They did not know how to handle a man who simply acted. One evening in June, a miner sat across from Holliday. The man was a giant of a man with a beard that reached his chest and eyes that were red from days of drinking. He had lost his claim's weekly yield in an hour of bad bets. He glared at Holliday, his hands clenching and unclenching. He accused Holliday of counting the cards, of cheating the box. It was the same old song. John Henry sighed, a wheezing sound. He told him to take his loss like a man and walk away. The miner stood up, overturning his chair. He reached for the heavy Colt Navy at his hip. John Henry was faster. He didn't draw his gun. He picked up the heavy brass spittoon from the floor beside him and smashed it into the man's face. The impact was sickening. Bone crunched and the miner went down like a felled tree, blood pouring from his nose and mouth. The room froze. John Henry stood over him, the dented spittoon in his hand. He looked at the unconscious man with disdain. He told the bartender to drag the trash out into the street. Then he sat back down and asked who was next. The game resumed. No one said a word. The brutality of the act, the use of such a crude weapon by such a refined-looking man, cemented his legend in the Gulch. He was unpredictable. He was dangerous. He was Doc Holliday. The summer wore on, the heat turning the mud into choking dust. John Henry's health did not improve. The damp nights and the smoke-filled days were taking their toll. He was losing weight, his ribs pushing against his skin like the bars of a cage. He coughed up blood every morning, staring at the red stains on his pillow. He knew he was dying. The realization did not make him sad. It made him reckless. He bet higher. He drank more. He courted danger as if it were a lover. He met other notable figures in the camp: Wild Bill Hickok, Calamity Jane. They were all drifting souls washed up on the shores of this gold rush, trying to find meaning or money in the chaos. He played cards with Hickok a few times, two legends sitting across from each other, wary and respectful. Hickok was losing his eyesight, paranoid and tired. John Henry was losing his lungs, angry and wired. They understood each other. August 2nd, 1876. Wild Bill Hickok was shot in the back of the head while playing poker at Nuttall and Mann's saloon. The news swept through the camp like wildfire. John Henry heard it and felt a cold chill that had nothing to do with the weather. Even the fastest gun, the greatest legend, could be erased in a second by a coward. It reinforced his worldview. There was no honor. There was no glory. There was only survival and eventually the end. He went to the saloon where it happened, looking at the blood on the floor. He ordered a drink and toasted the dead man. It was a reminder that death was always waiting, sometimes sitting right behind you. As autumn approached, the weather in the Black Hills turned vicious. The wind began to bite with a new intensity, carrying the promise of deep snows that would lock the gulch off from the world. John Henry knew he could not survive a winter here. The cold would finish what the bacteria had started. His lungs were already struggling to process the thin air. The crushing weight of a Dakota winter would collapse them entirely. He packed his bags in late September. He had made money, enough to keep him moving. He had survived the knife fights, the brawls, and the chaotic violence of the most lawless town in America. He had hardened his heart even further. He secured passage on a wagon train heading south back toward the rail lines. As the wagon climbed out of the gulch, John Henry looked back at Deadwood. It was a scar on the land, a testament to human greed and misery. He felt no nostalgia. He felt only the urge to keep moving, to stay ahead of the frost. He was a leaf on the wind, blowing from one rough town to another, waiting for the final gust that would tear him apart. He checked his revolver, the metal cold against his palm. He checked his deck of cards. He was ready for the next hand. The journey south was a retreat from the encroaching winter. The wagon train moved slowly, battling the mud that was beginning to freeze into ruts of iron. John Henry sat wrapped in blankets, his body shivering uncontrollably. The fever was back, burning him from the inside while the wind froze him from the outside. He hallucinated in the dark hours of the night, seeing the faces of the men he had cut, the men he had shot at. They looked at him with hollow eyes, accusing him of nothing, simply watching. He coughed until his ribs felt as if they would snap. The other passengers gave him a wide berth, afraid of the sickness, afraid of the man. They reached the railhead in Cheyenne just as the first heavy snows began to fall. John Henry boarded a train heading south toward warmer climes. He needed the heat. He needed the desert. He needed Texas again or somewhere like it. He sat in the train car, the heat from the potbelly stove a mercy to his aching bones. He watched the white landscape roll by, a blank canvas upon which nothing was written. He was 25 years old and he felt 80. The drift continued. He was a shark that had to keep swimming or die. He closed his eyes and listened to the rhythm of the wheels. Clack, 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 clack. It sounded like the ticking of a clock. It sounded like time running out. He arrived back in Denver for a brief stopover, but the city held no charm for him now. It was too cold, too civilized. He needed the raw edge of the frontier. He heard rumors of a town in Texas, a place called Fort Griffin, a place where the buffalo hunters gathered, where the law was scarce and the money was loose. It sounded like hell. It sounded like home. He bought a ticket. The train pulled out of the station, carrying him away from the mountains, away from the snow, down toward the flat, dusty plains where the devil himself would feel comfortable. John Henry Holliday settled back in his seat, a ghost in a black coat, riding the iron horse toward his destiny. The Deadwood drift was over. The Fort Griffin chapter was about to begin, the winter of 1877 to 1878. The wagon rumbled down the steep, treacherous incline that separated the respectable military outpost on the hill from the squalid settlement in the valley below. John Henry Holliday sat on the bench seat, his eyes watering from the stinging dust that hung perpetually over the basin. They called this place the Flat. a name that implied a benign-level geography but failed to capture the festering moral sinkhole that existed between the clear fork of the Brazos River and the limestone bluffs. Fort Griffin, Texas, was not a town. It was a terminal station for the buffalo trade, a place where the slaughter of millions of animals was converted into currency, whiskey, and violence. The smell hit him long before the buildings came into view. It was a dense, cloying odor of rotting meat, arsenic used for curing hides, and the unwashed bodies of thousands of men. It was the scent of death on an industrial scale, a perfume that John Henry found grimly appropriate for his current station in life. He stepped off the wagon onto the dirt thoroughfare, his boots sinking into a mixture of mud and offal. The flat was a chaotic jumble of canvas tents, shanties made of flattened tin cans, and hastily erected wooden saloons that leaned precariously in the wind. The streets were choked with freight wagons stacked high with stiff, flinty buffalo hides, waiting for transport to the railheads in Fort Worth or Dodge City. Skinners, their clothes stiff with dried blood and grease, roamed the boardwalks like ghouls, their knives still hanging from their belts. Soldiers from the fort on the hill ventured down to spend their pay on cheap liquor and cheaper companionship, adding a volatile layer of military discipline gone wrong to the anarchy of the hunters. John Henry adjusted his coat, checking the fit of his revolver against his hip. He was a long way from the high peaks of the Rockies, and the descent had brought him to the very bottom of the frontier's hierarchy. He found employment at Chauncey's Saloon, a watering hole owned by John Chauncey, a man who understood the delicate art of catering to violent men without getting shot. Chauncey hired Holliday not for his charm, but for his ability to control a game. The saloon was a rough establishment, the floor covered in sawdust to soak up the tobacco juice and the occasional spill of blood. The bar was a slab of rough-hewn timber, polished smooth by the sleeves of 1,000 drinkers. John Henry sat at his table, a beacon of sickly refinement amidst the grime. His cough had worsened in the damp river air, a constant rattling companion that shook his thin frame. He kept a bottle of whiskey at his elbow, sipping it to numb the irritation in his throat. He dealt the cards with mechanical precision, his blue eyes scanning the room, watching for the telltale signs of trouble that always preceded a fight. It was in this cesspool of humanity that he found the only creature who could match his own desperate intensity. Her name was Mary Catherine Horney, though the denizens of the flat knew her as Big Nose Kate. She was not a classic beauty of the Victorian ideal. She was something far more compelling. She was Hungarian by birth, educated, sharp-tongued, and utterly fearless. She worked the dance halls and the back rooms, surviving in a world that chewed up women and spat them out. John Henry first saw her arguing with a drunken teamster, her voice cutting through the din of the saloon with a vocabulary that would have made a sailor blush. She did not back down. She did not flinch. She stood her ground with a ferocity that mirrored his own. They gravitated toward each other like two shipwrecks colliding in a storm. Kate saw past the consumption, past the death mask of his face, and saw the brilliant, angry mind trapped underneath. John Henry saw a woman who did not ask for pity and did not offer it. Their relationship was not a romance in the traditional sense. It was a volatile alliance of two outcasts who found solace in their shared misery. They fought constantly, their arguments echoing through the thin walls of the boarding house where they lived. Plates were thrown, insults were exchanged, and threats were made. But they always returned to each other. In a world where everyone else was a potential enemy or a mark, Kate was the one person John Henry could turn his back on without fear of a knife finding his ribs. She nursed him when the fever spiked, wiping the cold sweat from his forehead with a rough tenderness. He defended her honor, such as it was, with a lethal readiness that terrified the local bullies. The days in Fort Griffin blended into a monotonous cycle of gambling, drinking, and coughing. The violence of the town was casual and constant. Men were killed over card games, over women, over the price of a drink. Bodies were dragged out into the street and left for the undertaker's wagon, just another piece of refuse to be cleared away. John Henry navigated this carnage with a bored detachment. He had seen enough death to be unimpressed by it. He sat at his table at Shancy's, watching the buffalo hunters blow their earnings in a single night. Among the faces that drifted through the smoke was a man named Lottie Dino, a famous gambler in her own right, and various outlaws passing through on their way to Mexico or the territories. One such outlaw was Dave Rudabaugh, a train robber with a price on his head. Rudabaugh was a braggart, a man who liked to hear his own voice. He sat at Holliday's table, drinking heavily and boasting of his exploits. John Henry listened, filing the information away not out of a desire to be a snitch, but because information was currency. Then came the day that shifted the trajectory of his life. It was a Tuesday, the saloon relatively quiet in the mid-afternoon lull. The sunlight slanted through the dirty windows, illuminating the dust motes, dancing in the stale air. The bat-wing doors swung open and a stranger stepped inside. He was not a buffalo hunter. He wore a clean dark suit, a wide-brimmed hat, and his boots were free of the muck that coated everyone else's footwear. He was tall, with broad shoulders and a mustache that drooped past the corners of his mouth. His eyes were hard, flat, and devoid of humor. He carried himself with a specific kind of confidence, the kind that comes from knowing exactly what one is capable of. He walked to the bar, his spurs chiming softly with each step. He did not order a drink. He asked for the proprietor. John Shancy walked over, wiping his hands on a rag. The stranger introduced himself. His name was Wyatt Earp. He was a deputy marshal from Dodge City, Kansas. He was hunting Dave Rudabaugh. The name rippled through the room, causing a few heads to turn, but most men kept their eyes on their drinks. Lawmen were not popular in the flat. To be a lawman here was to be a target, but this man, Earp, did not look like a target. He looked like the hunter. Shancy, ever the diplomat, leaned in and spoke quietly. He told Earp that Rudabaugh had indeed been there, but he had moved on. He said he didn't know where the outlaw had gone, but he knew someone who might. Shancy turned and pointed a finger toward the corner table where the consumptive dentist sat shuffling a deck of cards. Wyatt Earp turned and looked at Holliday. John Henry stopped shuffling. He looked back. For a long moment, the two men simply assessed each other. It was a recognition of species. They were both predators, though of different breeds. Earp was the law, a man of order and rules, a man who used violence to enforce civilization. Holliday was the chaos, a man who rejected rules, who used violence to express his nihilism. Yet there was a shared steel in their spines. Wyatt walked over to the table. He did not pull up a chair. He stood looming over the seated gambler. He asked if Holliday was the man they called Doc. John Henry coughed, a dry hacking sound, and nodded. He asked what business the marshal had with him. Wyatt explained his pursuit. He was tracking Rudabaugh and had lost the trail in the maze of cattle trails and buffalo camps. He needed to know where the outlaw had headed. Most men in Holliday's position would have told the lawman to go to hell. The code of the West, especially among the gambling fraternity, strictly forbade helping the police. To be a snitch was to invite a bullet in the back, but John Henry looked at Wyatt and saw something he rarely saw in other men. He saw competence. He saw a man who was not afraid, not posturing, just focused on the job. And perhaps he simply disliked Rudabaugh's boorish manners. The outlaw had been loud, rude, and a poor loser. In John Henry's mind, bad manners were a capital offense. He gestured for Wyatt to come closer. In a low voice, barely audible over the noise of the saloon, John Henry told him what he knew. Rudabaugh had mentioned heading back toward Kansas, specifically toward the jagged edge of the Caprock, planning to hide out until the heat died down. He gave Wyatt the specific location of a camp where Rudabaugh was likely to water his horses. He described the outlaw's horse, his companions, and his likely route. Wyatt listened intently, memorizing the details. When John Henry finished, Wyatt looked at him with a strange expression. It was not gratitude exactly, it was respect. He asked why Holliday would help him. John Henry shrugged, his thin shoulders rising and falling under his coat. He said he just didn't like the cut of Rudabaugh's jib. Wyatt extended his hand. John Henry looked at it for a second. It was a large, strong hand, the hand of a man who worked and fought. John Henry reached out with his own pale, slender hand. They shook. The grip was firm, a silent pact sealed in the smoky air of a Texas dive. There were no grand declarations of friendship, no vows of eternal loyalty. It was a transaction of respect between two dangerous men. Wyatt touched the brim of his hat, turned on his heel, and walked out of the saloon. John Henry watched him go, feeling a strange pull. For the first time in years, he had met a man he did not immediately want to kill or swindle. He poured himself another drink and went back to his cards, but the encounter lingered in his mind. The weeks following Wyatt's departure were restless ones for John Henry. The flat was becoming increasingly hostile. The local vigilante committee, a group of self-righteous citizens who hid behind white hoods in the cover of darkness, was beginning to clean up the town. They were lynching horse thieves and card cheats, leaving their bodies hanging from the pecan trees along the river. John Henry knew his time in Fort Griffin was drawing to a close. He was too conspicuous, too violent, and too associated with the vice trade to survive a purge. He had several run-ins with the local law, minor skirmishes that were escalating in intensity. One evening, a local bully named Ed Bailey sat at Holliday's table. Bailey was a favorite of the town's rougher element, a man who thought his popularity gave him license to intimidate. He began to pick at the discard pile, looking at the dead cards, a strict violation of the rules of poker. John Henry warned him twice, his voice polite but icy. Bailey ignored him, sneering at the sick dentist. On the third offense, John Henry did not speak. He reached out and raked the pot of coins toward his side of the table, declaring the hand void. Bailey roared and reached for the pistol in his lap. John Henry did not have his gun drawn. He did not have time, but he had a knife. In a blur of motion, he produced a blade and slashed it across Bailey's midsection. It was not a fatal blow, but it was messy. Bailey fell back, clutching his stomach, screaming that he had been gutted. The saloon erupted. Bailey's friends drew their Bailey's weapons. John Henry backed into the corner, his pistol now in his hand, holding the mob at bay. The town marshal arrived, disarmed Holliday, and hauled him off to the hotel room that served as a makeshift jail, as the actual jail was overflowing. The mood in the town turned ugly fast. The vigilantes gathered, talking of a rope. They wanted to hang the gambler who had cut up one of their own. John Henry sat in the hotel room, shackled to the bed, listening to the murmurs of the lynch mob gathering in the street below. He checked the window. It was barred. He tested the chains. They were solid. For the first time, he felt a flicker of genuine concern. Dying of tuberculosis was one thing. Being strangled by a mob of hypocrites was another. He waited for the door to crash open. But it was not the mob that came. It was Kate. She had heard the talk. She had seen the ropes being coiled. She did not panic. She acted. She went to the back of the hotel, creating a diversion. Some said she started a fire in a nearby shed. Others said she simply threatened the guard with a shotgun. The details were lost to the chaos of the night. What mattered was that she got into the room. She had a pistol. She tossed it to John Henry. He caught it, the weight familiar and reassuring. She had the keys to the shackles, lifted from the distracted guard or bribed from a sympathetic one. She unlocked him. They did not waste time with words. They went out the window, dropping into the alleyway. The night was filled with the shouts of the mob and the smell of smoke. They crept through the shadows, moving away from the light of the torches. Kate had horses waiting at the edge of town, saddled and ready. John Henry pulled himself into the saddle, his chest burning with the exertion. He looked at Kate. She was sitting her horse like a cavalryman, her face set in grim determination. They kicked the horses into a gallop, riding north, away from the flat, away from the vigilantes, away from the stench of buffalo hides. They rode hard through the night, putting miles between themselves and the rope. As the sun rose over the Texas plains, illuminating the endless expanse of grass, John Henry slowed his horse to a walk. He looked at Kate. She was covered in dust, her hair wild, her eyes tired. But she was there. She had saved his life. He owed her. And he remembered the lawman, Wyatt Earp, heading north to Kansas, Dodge City. That was where the action was, that was where the money was. And that was where the only man he respected had gone. John Henry looked north. The horizon was a flat line, a blank page. He felt the familiar rattle in his lungs, the reminder of his mortality. But he was still breathing. He was still free. He spurred his horse forward. The Fort Griffin chapter was closed, burned to the ground behind them. The alliance with Kate was forged in fire. And somewhere ahead, in the cattle towns of Kansas, a new alliance was waiting to be solidified. He rode toward Dodge City, a dying man riding into legend, with the devil at his side and a gun in his belt. Early June, 1878. The heat in Dodge City, Kansas was a physical weight, pressing down on the flat, treeless landscape with a relentless intensity. It was not the dry, crisp heat of the high desert, nor the humid blanket of Georgia, but a dusty, baking oppression that rose from the earth itself. The ground was a pulverized mixture of dried mud and manure, ground into a fine powder by the hooves of 1,000,000 Texas longhorns. This dust coated everything, the buildings, the horses, the men, in a uniform layer of gray grime. John Henry Holliday sat on the veranda of the Dodge House Hotel, watching the shimmering waves of heat rise from the street. He had arrived in the self-proclaimed queen of the cowtowns, with Mary Catherine Horney at his side, seeking a place where the money was loose and the law was flexible. Dodge City was the terminal point of the Great Western Cattle Trail, a chaotic intersection of commerce and vice where the morality of the East dissolved into the pragmatic savagery of the frontier. The town was divided by the Santa Fe Railroad tracks. North of the tracks lay the respectable businesses, the hotels, and the veneer of civilization. South of the tracks lay the deadline, a zone of saloons, brothels, and dance halls where the law was enforced only by the barrel of a gun. John Henry gravitated naturally to the south side. He found his place at the Long Branch Saloon, a drinking establishment that boasted the finest bar in the city and the highest stakes at the tables. The owner, Chalk Beeson, was a man who appreciated a dealer with steady hands and a reputation for violence. He hired Holliday to run the faro bank, recognizing that the gaunt dentist was a deterrent to the rowdy drovers who often tried to bully the house. John Henry sat behind the layout, his face a pale mask in the smoky lamplight, dealing cards to men who smelled of cattle sweat and trail dust. The dynamic in Dodge City was a constant grinding friction between the permanent residents and the transient Texas cowboys. The Texans viewed the town as a parasite, a place that existed solely to drain them of their hard-earned wages. They hated the Kansas lawmen whom they saw as Yankee oppressors and pimp marshals. The law in Dodge was represented by the Earp brothers, Wyatt, Virgil, and occasionally Morgan, along with Bat Masterson and Charlie Bassett. They were a formidable clique, men who enforced the ordinance against carrying firearms north of the tracks with a rigid, uncompromising authority. John Henry watched this conflict from his chair at the Long Branch. He had no love for the law, but he had a distinct distaste for the boorish behavior of the herdsmen. They were loud, unwashed, and disrespectful, traits that grated on his refined sensibilities. His health in the summer of 1878 was precarious. The dust of the stockyards irritated his lungs, causing inflammation that left him breathless and weak. He consumed whiskey in vast quantities, 3 quarts a day by some accounts, simply to maintain a baseline of functionality. The alcohol suppressed the cough and dulled the constant ache in his chest. He was a functional alcoholic, his tolerance so high that he rarely appeared drunk. Instead, the liquor seemed to preserve him, pickling his organs and freezing his emotions. He was 26 years old, but his hair was already graying at the temples and the skin around his eyes was etched with the lines of a man twice his age. He was a specter haunting the gambling halls, a reminder of mortality amidst the celebration of the cattle drive. Wyatt Earp was the assistant marshal of Dodge City that summer. He was a man of few words, patrolling the streets with his revolver bumping against his thigh. He walked with a deliberate, intimidating stride, his eyes scanning the crowds for trouble. Since their brief meeting in Fort Griffin, a silent understanding had existed between Holliday and Earp. They were not yet close friends, but they acknowledged each other with a nod when their paths crossed. Wyatt tolerated Holliday's presence in the town because he knew the gambler was deadly but not disorderly. John Henry respected Wyatt because the marshal was the only man in Dodge who did not seem afraid of the Texans. The tension in the town grew as the summer wore on, the heat flaring tempers and the sheer volume of cowboys overwhelming the small police force. Mid-September, 1878. The season was winding down, but the violence was peaking. A group of particularly rowdy cowboys had ridden into town led by men like Tobe Driscoll and Ed Morrison. These were not mere trail hands. They were hard cases, men with histories of violence and a deep-seated hatred for the Earp faction. They spent the afternoon drinking in the saloons south of the tracks, boasting that they would run the marshals out of town before they left. The air in the Long Branch was thick with menace. John Henry sat at his faro table, shuffling the deck with a rhythmic snap. He watched the Texans at the bar. They were loud, aggressive, and heavily armed, having ignored the ordinance to check their guns. Night fell, bringing no relief from the heat. The Long Branch was packed. The piano player hammered out a frantic tune, trying to drown out the noise of the arguments erupting at the bar. Ed Morrison, a man with a face scarred by years of brawling, was shouting about the fighting pimp, Wyatt Earp. He waved a heavy six-shooter in the air, the lamplight catching the dull blue steel. The patrons gave him a wide berth. Morrison was known to be unpredictable when drunk, and he was currently consumed by a lethal mixture of whiskey and resentment. He wanted blood. He wanted to make a statement that the Texans owned Dodge City. Wyatt Earp entered the Long Branch through the front doors. He was alone. It was a tactical error, born of arrogance or perhaps just the fatigue of a long shift. He stepped into the room, his eyes locking on Morrison. The music stopped abruptly. The silence that followed was heavy and sudden, the kind of silence that precedes an explosion. Wyatt walked toward the bar, his hand resting near his holster. He told Morrison to holster his weapon or get out. It was a standard command delivered with the flat, unemotional tone of a man used to being obeyed. But this time the command was rejected. Morrison laughed, a harsh barking sound. He did not holster his gun. Instead, he leveled it at Wyatt's chest. At the same moment, Tobe Driscoll and 3 other cowboys stepped out from the shadows of the room, their own revolvers drawn. They formed a semicircle around the marshal, cutting off his retreat. Wyatt froze. He was a fast draw, perhaps one of the fastest, but he was not faster than 5 men who already had their hammers cocked. The mathematics of the situation were absolute. If he moved his hand, he would be cut to pieces by a volley of 45 caliber slugs. He stood still, his face impassive, staring down the barrel of Morrison's gun. The cowboys sneered, sensing their victory. They had the famous marshal cornered, helpless, and alone. They began to taunt him, hurling insults, daring him to reach for his iron. John Henry Holliday watched the scene from the back of the room. He had been ignored by the cowboys, dismissed as a sickly card sharp of no consequence. He sat with his chair leaned back against the wall, his hands resting on the felt of the faro layout. He saw the geometry of the ambush. He saw the inevitability of Wyatt's death. He did not care about the law. He did not care about the peace of Dodge City. But he looked at Wyatt Earp, standing alone against a pack of wolves, and he felt a surge of cold, clarifying rage. It was the unfairness of it. It was the lack of style. It was 5 against 1, and that offended his sense of professional courtesy. John Henry moved. He did not stand up and shout a challenge. He did not make a speech. He simply slid out of his chair, his movement fluid and silent. He reached into the recess of the faro table where he kept his peacekeeper. It was not his usual Colt Navy. It was a sawed-off, double-barreled shotgun, a weapon of devastating close-range power. He kept it there for disputes over the bank, but tonight it would serve a different purpose. He moved through the crowd, a shadow detaching itself from the wall. The cowboys were focused entirely on Wyatt, their eyes fixed on their prey. They did not see the gaunt figure approaching from their flank. John Henry stepped up behind Ed Morrison. He did not hesitate. He jammed the twin barrels of the shotgun into the cowboy's ear. The metal was cold and hard against the skin. The sound of the hammers being cocked was loud in the silent room, 2 distinct metallic clicks that signaled imminent death. Morrison flinched, his eyes going wide. He froze, the revolver in his hand wavering. The other cowboys turned their heads, startled by the sudden intrusion. They saw the dentist standing there, his face pale and sweaty, his eyes burning with a manic intensity. He looked like a demon that had just crawled out of a grave to drag them back down with him. "Throw him up," John Henry hissed. His voice was a rasping whisper, wet with the fluid in his lungs, but it carried across the room like a crack of thunder. "You bastards, throw him up or I'll blow this man's head into the street." The threat was not a bluff. Everyone in the room knew it. They looked at John Henry's hand on the trigger. The knuckles were white. The finger was tightening. This was not a lawman who would hesitate to shoot because of paperwork or conscience. This was a killer who viewed violence as a recreational activity. Morrison dropped his gun. It hit the floor with a heavy thud. The fear on his face was absolute. He felt the cold circle of the muzzle against his skull and knew that his life was being held by a thread of spider silk. The other cowboys hesitated. They still outnumbered the marshal and the dentist, but the dynamic had shifted. Their leader was a hostage, and the man holding the shotgun looked unstable, a loose cannon who might pull the trigger just to see the spray. Wyatt Earp seized the moment. He drew his revolver, the barrel clearing leather with a smooth, practiced motion. He cracked Tobe Driscoll across the skull with the heavy barrel, sending the cowboy to his knees. "Drop them!" Wyatt roared, his voice returning to its full authority. The cowboys looked from the shotgun to the revolver. The fight had gone out of them. They were bullies who relied on intimidation, and they had just been out-intimidated. One by one, they lowered their weapons. They dropped their belts. The sound of heavy iron hitting the floorboards echoed through the saloon. The patrons, who had been holding their breath, let out a collective sigh. The tension broke, replaced by the murmuring of relief. Wyatt kept his gun trained on the group while John Henry kept the shotgun pressed firmly against Morrison's head. "Get out," Wyatt ordered. "Get out of this town and don't come back." The cowboys, stripped of their weapons and their dignity, scrambled for the door. They stumbled out into the night, their spurs jingling, leaving their guns behind. Morrison was the last to go. John Henry pulled the shotgun back, releasing the pressure. He looked at the cowboy with a sneer of pure contempt. Morrison looked at the dentist, his eyes filled with hate, but he said nothing. He turned and ran, disappearing into the darkness of Front Street. The saloon was quiet again. Wyatt Earp holstered his gun. He looked at the pile of confiscated weapons on the floor, then he looked at John Henry Holliday. The dentist was uncocking the shotgun, his hands trembling slightly now that the adrenaline was fading. He placed the weapon back on the faro table and sat down, reaching for his glass of whiskey. He took a long swallow, coughing as the liquid hit his raw throat. He wiped his mouth with the back of his hand and looked up at the marshal. Wyatt walked over to the table. He did not smile. He did not offer a handshake, not yet. He simply looked at the man who had just saved his life. He knew that without John Henry's intervention, he would be dead on the floor, his body riddled with holes. It was a debt, a life debt. In the code of the frontier, such a debt could never fully be repaid, but it could never be forgotten. Wyatt rested his hand on the back of John Henry's chair. "Much obliged, Doc," Wyatt said quietly. John Henry shrugged, dealing a card off the top of the deck. "I just couldn't let them kill you, Wyatt," he wheezed, a cynical smile touching his lips. "You're the only one in this town who understands how to play the game." That night in the Long Branch saloon shifted the axis of their relationship. Before they were acquaintances, now they were brothers in arms. The incident cemented a bond that would endure through years of violence, vendettas, and tragedy. The town of Dodge City buzzed with the story. The sick dentist had backed down the Texas mob. The lunger had sand. The residents who had looked down on Holliday as a vagrant and a nuisance now looked at him with a mixture of fear and awe. He was no longer just a gambler. He was the man who walked beside Wyatt Earp. The alliance had consequences. By aligning himself with the Earps, John Henry inherited their enemies. The cowboys who had been humiliated that night would not forget. They would carry the grudge back to Texas, and they would bring it with them when they returned. The friction between the factions deepened, becoming a personal war. John Henry accepted this. He thrived on it. He had chosen a side not because of morality, but because of the man. Wyatt Earp was the rock, the immovable object. John Henry Holliday was the fire, the consuming force. Together, they were a terrifying combination. The rest of the summer passed in a haze of heat and dust, but the atmosphere had changed. The cowboys walked softer around the Long Branch. They checked their guns when told. They whispered about the deadly dentist who kept a shotgun under his table. John Henry continued to deal faro, his cough worsening with the approach of autumn. He knew his time in Dodge was limited. The winters on the plains were brutal, and his lungs could not withstand another season of freezing winds. But for now, he was a king of the deadline. He spent his nights drinking with Wyatt, Virgil, and Bat Masterson. They sat in the back rooms of the saloons discussing politics, gambling, and the nature of men. John Henry, the educated Southern gentleman, found a strange intellectual kinship with these rough lawmen. They were the only men who treated him as an equal, not as a dying invalid. They respected his mind and his nerve. He told them stories of the South, of the war, quoting classics in between coughing fits. They listened, fascinated by the paradox of the man, a killer who quoted Latin, a doctor who dealt death. As October approached, the cattle herds began to thin out. The drovers returned to Texas, taking their money and their stories with them. Dodge City began to settle into its winter hibernation. The streets grew quieter. The dust settled. John Henry felt the chill in the air and knew he had to move. The cold was his enemy, more dangerous than any cowboy with a six-shooter. He looked at the map in his mind. New Mexico, Arizona, territories further south and west, places where the sun was stronger and the air was drier. Wyatt was also restless. The job of policing a cow town was grueling and thankless. He talked of silver strikes in the mountains, of boom towns where a man could make a fortune without wearing a badge. He mentioned a place called Tombstone, a new strike in the Arizona desert. The name appealed to John Henry's dark sense of humor. Tombstone. It sounded like a destination. It sounded like a prophecy. When Wyatt finally resigned his commission and prepared to leave Dodge, John Henry began to pack as well. He could not stay without the protection of the Earp Star. The enemies he had made would circle back as soon as Wyatt was gone. And besides, the bond had been forged. Where Wyatt went, the trouble would follow, and John Henry wanted to be there when it started. He had invested in this friendship with the currency of violence, and he intended to see the return on his investment. He packed his bags in his room at the Dodge house. The shotgun went in first, wrapped in oilcloth, then the revolvers, then the cards. He looked at the town one last time from his window. It was a dusty, ugly collection of shacks, but it had been the stage for a pivotal moment in his life. He had proven something to himself and to the world in that saloon. He was not just a victim of a disease. He was a force to be reckoned with. He closed the suitcase and snapped the latches shut. The Dodge City debt had been paid in full, but a new ledger was opening. The road to the southwest lay open, winding through the mountains toward a destiny written in blood and silver. John Henry Holliday, the fearless invalid, walked out of the hotel and into the history books, leaving the dust of Kansas behind him forever. July 19th, 1879. The sun over Las Vegas, New Mexico, did not set so much as it collapsed behind the Sangre de Cristo Mountains, leaving the sky bruised with streaks of violet and blood orange. The air at this altitude was thin, crisp, and deceptively clear, carrying the scent of piñon smoke and dried chili peppers. John Henry Holliday stood in the doorway of the saloon he had financed on Center Street, a lit cigar clamped between his teeth. He watched the twilight settle over the plaza, his eyes narrowing against the lingering glare. This town was a different beast than the cattle hubs of Kansas. It was older, harder, and steeped in a history of conflict between the established Hispanic population and the encroaching Anglo tide. The architecture was adobe and timber, low-slung buildings that seemed to grow out of the red earth, designed to withstand both the heat of summer and the arrows of the Apache. John Henry had arrived here hoping the high desert air would act as a balm for his ravaged lungs. The humidity of the south and the dust of the cattle trails had taken a severe toll, and he was now 27 years old with the respiratory system of an octogenarian. But Las Vegas was no sanitarium. It was a lawless, booming frontier outpost, split geographically and culturally between the old town around the plaza and the new town springing up near the railroad tracks. The tension between the two districts created a constant vibrating energy of potential violence. John Henry naturally had set up shop right in the middle of it. He was trying his hand at being a proprietor, running a gambling hall where he could control the environment, the odds, and the clientele. He wore a linen suit to combat the heat, his boots polished to a high shine, maintaining the facade of the Southern aristocrat even as his body consumed itself from the inside. The saloon was filling up as the darkness deepened. Men drifted in from the railroad camps and the cattle ranges, their pockets heavy with silver and their throats parched. The noise level rose steadily, a chaotic mix of English and Spanish punctuated by the clinking of glass and the riffling of cards. John Henry moved through the room with a proprietary air, checking the tables, nodding to the regulars, and keeping a sharp eye on the heavy drinkers. He was drinking gin on this particular evening, the botanical sting of the liquor acting as a temporary anesthetic for the raw ulcers in his throat. He coughed periodically, a wet, rattling sound that he muffled with a silk handkerchief, but he did not let it break his stride. He was the master of ceremonies in this theater of vice, and he played the role with a grim dedication. Among the patrons that night was a man named Mike Gordon. Gordon was a former Army scout, a man who had survived the brutal campaigns against the tribes only to lose himself in the bottle. He was a familiar figure in Las Vegas, known for his loud mouth, his volatile temper, and his infatuation with one of the saloon girls who worked the hall. Gordon had been drinking since noon, consuming vast quantities of cheap whiskey that stripped away his reason and left only a simmering, aggressive paranoia. He sat at a corner table, his uniform jacket stained and unbuttoned, glaring at the room with bloodshot eyes. He was a ticking bomb, and everyone in the establishment knew it. The other patrons gave him a wide berth, sensing the violence radiating off him like heat waves from a stove. John Henry watched Gordon from the bar. He knew the type well. The frontier was littered with men like Gordon, soldiers who could not adjust to peace, who needed the adrenaline of conflict to feel alive. John Henry did not fear him, but he recognized the disruption he represented. A brawl would damage the furniture, scare away the high rollers, and bring the unwanted attention of the local authorities, who were already suspicious of the new gambling operator. John Henry signaled the bartender to cut Gordon off. It was a business decision, executed with cold logic. The bartender, a stout man with a nervous disposition, approached Gordon's table and delivered the news. Gordon did not take it well. The ex-scout slammed his fist onto the table, the impact jumping the glasses and silencing the nearby conversations. He stood up, swaying slightly, his hand resting on the grip of the revolver at his hip. He began to shout, his voice slurring but loud enough to reach every corner of the room. He cursed the bartender. He cursed the establishment, and he cursed the lunger who ran it. He demanded to see the girl he fancied, a woman who had long since tired of his drunken advances and was currently hiding in the back room. Gordon's face was flushed a deep, unhealthy red, the veins in his neck bulging as he screamed his grievances to the indifferent audience. John Henry stepped out from behind the bar. He did not shout back. He did not draw a weapon. He simply walked toward Gordon with a slow, deliberate pace. The room went quiet. The patrons turned to watch, sensing the shift from a drunk's rant to a lethal confrontation. John Henry stopped 10 feet from the scout. He looked Gordon up and down with a gaze of utter boredom. He spoke in a voice that was barely more than a whisper, yet it carried the weight of a judge passing sentence. He told Gordon to leave. He told him he was no longer welcome, that his money was no good, and that his presence was an offense to the dignity of the house. Gordon blinked, trying to focus on the slim figure in the white suit. He saw the fragility of the dentist, the sunken chest, the pale skin. He mistook illness for weakness. He laughed, a harsh barking sound, and spat on the floor near John Henry's boots. He called Holliday a sick dog, a coward who hid behind a deck of cards. He reached for his gun, not to draw it fully, but to emphasize his threat. John Henry did not flinch. He did not move his hand toward his own weapon. He simply stared at Gordon, his blue eyes empty of fear, empty of anger, empty of everything but a cold calculation. He repeated the command, "Get out." Something in John Henry's demeanor penetrated the whiskey fog clouding Gordon's brain. It was the lack of reaction, the absolute stillness of the predator before the strike led. Gordon hesitated. He looked around the room, seeing no support from the other drinkers. His bravado faltered. He grunted a curse, turned on his heel, and stumbled toward the door. He kicked a chair over on his way out, a final, petty act of defiance. The batwing doors swung shut behind him, and the tension in the room released like a snapped bowstring. The conversation resumed. The piano player started a nervous tune, and John Henry returned to the bar, wiping a speck of dust from his lapel. But Mike Gordon was not done. The humiliation festered in him as he stood in the cool night air of Center Street. The alcohol fueled his rage, twisting his embarrassment into a desire for revenge. He felt wronged. He felt disrespected. He was a scout, a warrior, and he had been thrown out of a saloon by a dying dentist. He paced back and forth in the dirt street, shouting at the closed doors. He demanded the girl come out. He demanded Holliday come out. When no one answered, he decided to escalate the argument. He drew his revolver, a heavy-caliber army-issue piece, and leveled it at the front of the building. The first shot shattered the silence of the street and the window of the saloon simultaneously. The glass exploded inward, spraying the patrons near the front with shards. Men dove for the floor, overturning tables and scrambling for cover behind the bar. A second shot followed, punching a hole through the wood of the door frame and burying itself in the plaster of the back wall. Gordon was firing blindly, screaming incoherent threats, sending .45 caliber slugs tearing through the thin facade of the building. Inside, it was chaos. The music died instantly. The air filled with the smell of gunpowder drifting in from the street and the screams of the terrified customers. John Henry Holliday did not dive for cover. He stood behind the bar, his glass of gin undisturbed in his hand. He listened to the shots, counting them. 1, 2, 3. He analyzed the trajectory, the timing, the position of the shooter based on the sound. Gordon was standing right in front of the saloon in the middle of the street, making no attempt to use cover. He was challenging the house. He was challenging John Henry directly. This was no longer a business dispute. It was an assassination attempt. John Henry set his glass down on the mahogany surface. He did not hurry. He reached under his coat and withdrew his Colt revolver. He checked the cylinder, ensuring it was full. He moved toward the rear of the room, not to escape, but to flank. He knew that walking out the front door into a hail of bullets was suicide. He slipped out the back exit, moving into the alleyway that ran behind the buildings. The night was dark, the moon obscured by clouds, but John Henry knew the layout of the property intimately. He moved silently through the dust, circling around the side of the building. He could hear Gordon still shouting in the street, his voice ragged with exertion. The scout fired another shot, the muzzle flash illuminating the dusty plaza for a fraction of a second. John Henry emerged from the alleyway into the street, a shadow detaching itself from the darkness. He was now positioned to the side of the saloon, roughly 20 yards from where Gordon stood. The scout was reloading, fumbling with the cartridges in his belt, his hands shaking. He was focused entirely on the front door, expecting his enemy to cower inside or come charging out into his line of fire. He did not see the figure standing calmly in the street to his right. John Henry raised his pistol. He did not use a two-handed grip. He extended his right arm fully, turning his body sideways to present a smaller target, adopting the classic dueling stance. He took a breath, holding it to steady his aim. "Gordon," John Henry said. The word was not a shout. It was spoken at a conversational volume, flat and hard. Mike Gordon spun around, dropping a cartridge in the dirt. He saw Holliday standing there, bathed in the faint light spilling from the broken window. Gordon raised his weapon, trying to bring it to bear on the new threat. He was slow. The whiskey had dulled his reflexes, and the surprise had scrambled his coordination. He swung the heavy barrel of his gun toward the dentist, his finger tightening on the trigger. John Henry fired. The single shot cracked through the night air, a sharp, decisive report that silenced the shouting man instantly. The bullet struck Mike Gordon square in the chest, just below the rib cage. It was a gut shot, the most painful and lingering way to die, but at this range and with that placement, it was effectively fatal. The impact knocked Gordon backward as if he had been kicked by a mule. He fired his own weapon into the dirt as he fell, the bullet kicking up a spray of red dust. He hit the ground hard, his back arching, his hands clutching at the hole in his stomach. John Henry did not lower his gun. He held his stance, watching the fallen man. He waited to see if there was any fight left in the scout. Gordon groaned, a terrible, wet sound that bubbled up from his ruined internal organs. He tried to rise, his boots scrabbling in the dirt, but his legs refused to obey. He collapsed back onto the earth, his breathing turning into a ragged gasp. The blood began to pool beneath him, turning the dust into a dark, sticky mud. John Henry walked forward slowly, keeping his weapon trained on the body. He stopped 5 feet away and looked down. Gordon looked up at him, his eyes wide with shock and pain. There were no last words, no profound statements, just the gurgle of a man drowning in his own blood. The silence returned to the plaza, heavier now. The patrons inside the saloon began to cautiously emerge, stepping over the broken glass and peering out into the street. They saw the dentist standing over the scout, the smoking pistol still in his hand. They saw the blood spreading in the dirt. A murmur went through the crowd. This was not a drunken brawl. This was an execution. It was efficient, cold, and terrifyingly professional. John Henry looked at the gathering crowd, his expression unchanged. He holstered his gun with a smooth, practiced motion. He adjusted his coat. He looked at the bartender who was trembling in the doorway lead. "Get a doctor," John Henry said, his voice raspy, "though I doubt it will do him much good." He turned and walked back into the saloon, stepping through the shattered window frame. He went back to the bar, picked up his glass of gin and finished it in one swallow. His hand did not shake. His pulse, if anyone had dared to check it, would have been steady. The adrenaline that would have caused another man to tremble was, for him, just another fuel source. He poured another drink and looked at the damage to his establishment. The mirror behind the bar was cracked. The door frame was splintered. He sighed. It would cost money to fix. That was the only regret he felt. Mike Gordon did not die immediately. He lingered for hours in a back room where they carried him, screaming in agony as the peritonitis set in. He died the next day, July 20th. The death of a popular, albeit troublesome local figure brought immediate heat. The Hispanic population of Las Vegas viewed the killing with suspicion, seeing it as another example of Anglo violence. The friends of Mike Gordon, other scouts and hard men, began to talk of revenge. The local law enforcement, which had been wary of Holliday from the start, now had a valid reason to act. A warrant was discussed, a lynch mob was rumored, the atmosphere in the town shifted from welcoming to hostile overnight. John Henry knew the signs. He had seen them in Dallas, in Jacksboro, in Dodge. The window of opportunity in Las Vegas had slammed shut. He could stay and fight, kill a few more men, and eventually be overwhelmed by numbers or hanged by a committee. Or he could move on. He was a survivor, not a martyr. He had no attachment to the real estate, only to his own continued existence. He began to liquidate his assets immediately. He sold his interest in the saloon for a fraction of what it was worth, taking the loss without complaint. It was the cost of doing business. It was the price of the bullet. He went to his room to pack. The routine was familiar, a ritual of departure that he had performed too many times. The clothes, the books, the dental instruments that were now just relics of a former life. He packed the guns last, cleaning the Colt that had killed Gordon, wiping the powder residue from the cylinder. He checked the action, ensuring it was smooth. He was leaving Las Vegas, but he was taking the violence with him. It was a part of him now, as much a part of his physiology as the bacteria eating his lungs. The departure was hasty. He bought a buckboard wagon, deciding that the stagecoach was too public and too slow. He loaded his belongings under the cover of darkness. He did not say goodbye to the town. Las Vegas had been a disappointment. The air had not healed him, the business had not sustained him. It was just another stop on the road to the grave. He climbed onto the seat of the wagon, wrapping his coat tight against the night chill. He whipped the horses into motion, the wheels rattling over the uneven stones of the plaza. He drove past the spot where Mike Gordon had fallen. the bloodstain still visible as a dark patch in the dirt. He did not look down. He headed west, toward the territories that were even wilder, even further from the reach of civilization. He had heard of a new strike, a place where the silver was practically lying on the ground and the law was non-existent. Prescott, and beyond that, the San Pedro Valley. The names were just points on a map, but they offered the promise of anonymity and action. John Henry Holliday drove into the blackness of the New Mexico desert, a solitary figure under the vast indifferent stars. The Gordon slaughter was behind him, a bloody footnote in his history. Ahead lay the true crucible. Ahead lay Arizona, September 1880. The stagecoach crested the final rise of the Dragoon Mountains, the wooden wheels grinding against the loose shale of the road. John Henry Holliday sat in the passenger compartment, his body swaying with the violent motion of the carriage. The Arizona Territory spread out before him, a vast sun-baked panorama of scrub brush, cactus, and jagged rock formations that looked like the teeth of some subterranean leviathan breaking the surface. The air here was different from the high peaks of Colorado or the humid plains of Texas. It was superheated, dry, and filled with a fine alkaline dust that tasted of chalk and ancient bone. John Henry coughed, the spasm racking his frame, and spat out the window. The saliva evaporated almost instantly on the hot metal of the doorframe. He was 29 years old, but inside the rattling coach, gripping his valise with thin, pale fingers, he felt the weight of a century pressing down on his chest. He was heading toward Tombstone, a name that struck him as grimly appropriate for his final destination. It was the latest boomtown, a silver strike that had drawn every fortune-seeker, grifter, and desperado in the West to the San Pedro Valley. The town sat on a mesa between the Dragoon and Whetstone Mountains, a chaotic sprawl of white canvas tents and raw lumber buildings that seemed to vibrate with the energy of extraction. The stories claimed the silver was so pure you could cut it with a knife. But John Henry was not interested in mining. He was interested in the men who did the mining, the men who would need a place to spend their sudden wealth, and the men who would try to take it from them. More importantly, he was heading there because Wyatt Earp was there. The bond forged in Texas and cemented in Kansas had drawn him south, a moth flying toward the only flame that burned bright enough to hold his interest. The coach rolled into Allen Street in the middle of the afternoon. The noise was the first thing that hit him. It was a cacophony of hammers striking nails, mules braying, steam whistles from the stamp mills shrieking in the distance, and the constant low roar of human commerce. Tombstone was not a sleepy outpost. It was an industrial engine running red hot. John Henry stepped down into the dust, his boots sinking into the pulverized earth. He adjusted his coat, wiped the grit from his mustache, and scanned the street. It was lined with saloons, gambling halls, and brothels, interspersed with general stores and assay offices. The distinct smell of sagebrush mixed with the odors of horse manure, whiskey, and unwashed wool. It was the scent of opportunity. He found Wyatt Earp at the Oriental Saloon, a grand establishment that was trying to bring a touch of San Francisco luxury to the desert. The reunion was understated, as was their custom. A nod, a handshake, a drink poured from a bottle of decent rye. Wyatt introduced him to his brothers, Virgil and Morgan. Virgil was a solid block of a man, a veteran of the Civil War with a calm, authoritative demeanor. Morgan was younger, fiery, and quick to laugh, possessing a recklessness that mirrored John Henry's own. They were the law, or at least they represented a faction of it. Virgil was the deputy U.S. Marshal for the territory. They were trying to establish order in a place that thrived on anarchy. John Henry looked at the Earp brothers and saw a fortress. He immediately positioned himself as the artillery on their ramparts. The political landscape of Tombstone was a minefield. On one side were the Earps and the town's business elite, mining magnates, shopkeepers, and Republicans who wanted stability to ensure profits. On the other side was the cowboy faction, a loose confederation of cattle rustlers, stagecoach robbers, and Southern Democrats who viewed the Earps as northern interlopers and tyrants. These men wore red sashes around their waists as a badge of defiance. They were led by men like Curly Bill Brocious and Johnny Ringo. Violent, charismatic figures who held sway over the rural areas surrounding the town. The county sheriff, Johnny Bean, was politically aligned with the cowboys, using their support to maintain his position and skimming profits from their illicit activities. It was a powder keg, and John Henry had walked right into the center of it with a lit match. He established himself quickly, taking over the faro bank at the Oriental Saloon. The job suited him. He sat behind the layout, the casekeeper at his side, dealing cards with a hypnotic rhythm. The dust of the town aggravated his condition severely. He was drinking massive amounts of whiskey to keep the cough at bay, consuming pints of the amber liquid throughout the day and night. It did not make him drunk in the stumbling, slurring sense. It simply turned his blood cold and stripped away his remaining inhibitions. He became known in Tombstone not just as a gambler but as a ticking bomb. The local toughs, the cowboys with their red sashes, learned to give the skinny dentist a wide berth. There was something in his eyes, a flat, dead look, that promised immediate and disproportionate violence. October 10th, 1880. The tension in the town had been building for weeks. The cowboys were becoming more brazen, riding into town, shooting out streetlights, and harassing the citizens. The Earps were pushing back, using pistol whippings and jail cells to enforce the ordinance against carrying weapons. John Henry was in the middle of it, his loyalty to Wyatt absolute. But the constant friction was fraying his nerves. On this particular Sunday, the pressure finally snapped. The location was the Oriental Saloon. The antagonist was Milt Joyce. Milt Joyce was a county supervisor and a partner in the Oriental. He was a large man, physically imposing and politically connected to the anti-Earp faction. He had never liked Holliday. He viewed the dentist as a liability, a sickly, dangerous drunk who drove away respectable customers and attracted trouble. Joyce had been looking for an excuse to bar Holliday from the premises to assert his authority and clean up the image of his establishment. On this afternoon, John Henry gave him the excuse. John Henry had been drinking since breakfast. The whiskey had soured in his stomach, fueling a belligerent, argumentative mood. He was standing at the bar, loud and abrasive, making disparaging remarks about the quality of the establishment and the character of the men who ran it. He saw Joyce behind the bar and focused his ire on the big man. He insulted Joyce's politics, his friends, and his integrity. It was a verbal assault, precise and cutting, designed to provoke. Joyce, his face flushing with anger, told Holliday to shut his mouth. John Henry laughed, a wet, hacking sound, and continued his tirade. Joyce had had enough. He came out from behind the bar, moving with the momentum of a freight train. He grabbed John Henry by the collar of his coat and the seat of his trousers. The physical disparity was immense. Joyce manhandled the frail gambler, dragging him toward the door. John Henry struggled, cursing, his boots scraping uselessly against the floorboards. Joyce threw him out onto the boardwalk of Allen Street like a sack of grain. The impact knocked the wind out of John Henry. He lay in the dust for a moment, humiliated, the laughter of the saloon patrons ringing in his ears. This was the breaking point. John Henry Holliday did not accept humiliation. He stood up, brushing the dirt from his coat. His face was pale, his eyes burning with a manic fury. He checked his pockets. He was unarmed. Joyce had made sure of that before tossing him out. But John Henry was never truly disarmed as long as he had access to his room. He walked down the street to his boarding house, his stride stiff and jerky. He went to his room, opened his trunk and took out his Colt revolver. He checked the load. 6 cartridges. He snapped the cylinder shut. He did not cool down. The walk back to the Oriental only served to concentrate his rage into a diamond-hard point of intent. He pushed through the batwing doors of the Oriental saloon 10 minutes later. The room went silent. Milt Joyce was still behind the bar, wiping down the mahogany, looking smug. He saw Holliday enter, saw the gun in his hand, and his smugness evaporated. John Henry did not make a speech. He did not offer a duel. He walked toward the bar, raising the heavy pistol. "Turn loose," he hissed, the words bubbling up through the phlegm in his throat. Joyce did not wait to be shot. He was a fighter, and he knew that hesitation was death. He grabbed a heavy stoneware pitcher from the counter and hurled it at Holliday while simultaneously diving toward him. John Henry fired. The shot went wild, smashing into the mirror behind the bar, sending shards of glass raining down onto the bottles. The room erupted into chaos. Men dove for cover, overturning tables. Joyce closed the distance. He was on top of Holliday before the dentist could cock the hammer for a second aimed shot. John Henry fired again in the grapple. The bullet tore through the fleshy part of Joyce's hand, entering the palm and exiting the back, shattering the small bones. Joyce roared in pain but did not stop. He crashed into Holliday, driving him back against a poker table. The impact knocked the breath out of John Henry. He pulled the trigger a third time blindly. The slug missed Joyce entirely and struck the bartender, a man named Parker, in the big toe of his left foot. Parker screamed and hopped backward, clutching his boot. The fight devolved into a brutal close-quarters struggle. Joyce, despite his ruined hand, was fueled by adrenaline and the size advantage. He grabbed the barrel of John Henry's revolver, wrestling for control. The heat of the barrel seared his skin, but he didn't let go. He twisted the weapon, wrenching it from John Henry's grasp. Now Joyce had the gun. He did not shoot. He used the heavy weapon as a bludgeon. He swung the Colt in a vicious arc, bringing the steel barrel down onto John Henry's head. The sound was sickening, a dull, wet thud of metal striking bone. The scalp split open. Blood sprayed across the floor. John Henry's knees buckled. He collapsed, his vision going white. Joyce stood over him, breathing heavily, blood dripping from his hand, the pistol raised for another blow. Bystanders rushed in, grabbing Joyce, restraining him before he could deliver a killing strike. The fight was over. It had lasted less than 30 seconds, but the violence had been absolute. John Henry lay on the floor, semi-conscious, the blood pooling around his head and soaking into the sawdust. He tried to rise, but his limbs would not obey. He could hear the shouting, the accusations, the cries of the wounded bartender. He felt a strange detachment, as if he were watching the scene from the ceiling. He had come back. He had pulled the trigger. He had made his point. No man touched him without consequences. The pain in his head was blinding, a rhythmic throbbing that matched the beat of his heart. But through the haze, he felt a grim satisfaction. The marshal arrived, dragging John Henry off to the town jail. He spent the night in a cell, his head wrapped in a bloody bandage, his body aching from the beating. The alcohol slowly wore off, leaving him with a crushing hangover and the sharp, stinging reality of his injuries. The next morning he was brought before the magistrate. The charge was assault with a deadly weapon. Milt Joyce, his hand bandaged, testified with venom in his voice. The town was scandalized. The lunger had finally gone too far. John Henry pleaded guilty. He had no defense. He had walked in and started shooting. The judge fined him $20 for assault and battery and $11.25 for court costs. It was a pittance, a slap on the wrist. The leniency was perhaps due to the chaotic nature of the fight, or perhaps because Joyce had thrown him out first. John Henry paid the fine from a roll of bills in his pocket. He walked out of the courtroom, his head bandaged, his face bruised, but his stride steady. The incident with Joyce drew a line in the sand. The Oriental Saloon was now enemy territory. But curiously, the dynamic shifted shortly after. Wyatt Earp, ever the pragmatist, bought a quarter interest in the Oriental's gambling concession. He effectively became partners with Milt Joyce. This forced a truce. Joyce had to tolerate Holliday because Holliday was with Earp. John Henry had to tolerate Joyce because Joyce was Wyatt's partner. It was an uneasy peace, held together by the glue of profit. John Henry returned to the Oriental, taking his seat at the faro bank as if nothing had happened. He sat there, a bandage on his head, dealing cards to men who whispered about the shooting. He looked Milt Joyce in the eye when he ordered a drink. Joyce served him, his maimed hand a constant reminder of the cost of touching the dentist. The winter of 1880 rolled into the spring of 1881. The tension in Tombstone did not dissipate. It concentrated. The cowboys continued their depredations. Stagecoaches were robbed. Cattle were rustled from Mexico and sold in the local butcher shops. The Earp brothers tightened their grip on the town police force. John Henry was their shadow. He walked the streets at night, his coat collar turned up against the desert chill, his eyes scanning the alleys. He knew the explosion was coming. The fight with Joyce had been a skirmish, a personal duel. The real war was gathering on the horizon. He met the key players of the opposing army. He saw Ike Clanton, a blustering, cowardly man who talked tough when he was drunk and pleaded when he was sober. He saw Tom and Frank McClory, hard-working ranchers who had thrown in their lot with the rustlers. And he saw Johnny Ringo. Ringo was the dark mirror of Holliday. He was educated, moody, and arguably suicidal. When they met, the air seemed to drop in temperature. They circled each other like wolves, trading quotes from Shakespeare and Latin insults. They recognized the same darkness in each other's souls. Ringo was the only cowboy John Henry respected, and therefore the only one he truly wanted to kill. The environment of Tombstone was eating John Henry alive. The dust was a constant abrasive in his lungs. He coughed up tissue and blood daily. He was losing weight, his clothes hanging on him like a shroud. But the illness only sharpened his resolve. He knew he was on borrowed time. Every sunrise was a victory. Every sunset was a gamble. He had nothing to lose, which made him the most dangerous man in the territory. He was not fighting for land or cattle or political power. He was fighting because it was the only thing that made him feel alive. As the summer of 1881 approached, the atmosphere in the town became toxic. The newspapers, the Tombstone Epitaph, pro-Earp, and the Nugget, pro-Cowboy, waged a war of words, inflaming the populace. Threats were exchanged daily. The cowboys openly bragged that they would kill the Earps. The Earps responded with arrests and pistol whippings. John Henry stood firmly beside his friends. He was deputized on occasion, wearing a badge that looked absurd on his sunken chest, but no one laughed. They had seen what he did to Milt Joyce. They knew that behind the badge was a man who would empty his revolver without hesitation. The stage was being set for the final act. The players were taking their positions. The hatred was calcifying into a solid, impenetrable wall. John Henry Holliday, the dying gambler, sat at his table in the Oriental, shuffling the cards, waiting for the deal. He could feel the vibration of the coming storm in the floorboards. He poured another glass of whiskey, the amber liquid, catching the light. He drank it down, suppressing the cough that rattled his ribs. He was ready. Tombstone was not just a town, it was a crucible, and he was ready to be tested in the fire. The Joyce affair had been a messy, drunken brawl. The next time he pulled his gun, it would be war. October 26, 1881. The dawn broke over Tombstone, Arizona, with a biting chill that defied the desert location. A storm had blown in during the night, dropping a dusting of snow on the Dragoon Mountains and sending a fierce, cutting wind screaming down the San Pedro Valley. The air was gray and metallic, carrying the scent of wood smoke and impending violence. John Henry Holliday woke in his room at Fly's boarding house, the cold seeping through the thin walls and settling into his joints. His lungs felt brittle, filled with the fluid that accumulated during the night. He coughed, a long tearing spasm that brought up a mouthful of blood and phlegm. He spat into the basin, the red fluid stark against the white porcelain. He dressed with slow, deliberate movements. He put on a heavy gray woolen shirt, a vest, and his trousers. He strapped on his gun belt, the leather cold and stiff. Over it all, he threw a long gray ulster coat that reached down past his knees. It was a garment for a winter funeral, loose enough to conceal the skeletal frame of the man beneath and the arsenal he intended to carry. The events of the previous 24 hours had set the stage for a collision that was now unavoidable. Ike Clanton, fueled by whiskey and a bottomless well of bravado, had spent the night moving from saloon to saloon, threatening to kill the Earp brothers and the Lunger Holliday on sight. John Henry had encountered Ike at the Alhambra saloon the night before, taunting the drunken cowboy, urging him to draw his weapon. Ike had declined, claiming he was unarmed, but the threats had continued until dawn. Now the town was awake, and the tension was a physical pressure in the streets. The citizens moved quickly, heads down, sensing that the verbal sparring was over. The time for talking had passed. The time for iron had arrived. John Henry walked out onto Fremont Street. The wind whipped the hem of his long coat around his legs. He found Virgil Earp, the city marshal, and Morgan Earp near the intersection of 4th and Allen. They looked tired. They had been up all night dealing with Ike's antics. Virgil had already pistol-whipped Ike earlier that morning, hauling him before the judge for carrying weapons. Wyatt had done the same to Tom McClory, cracking the cowboy's skull with the barrel of his revolver when Tom had challenged him. The Earps were done with warnings. They were enforcing the law with the blunt end of their pistols. But the cowboys were not retreating. They were gathering. Reports came in that Frank McClory and Billy Clanton had arrived in town, heavily armed and looking for a fight. They were assembling at a vacant lot on Fremont Street near the rear entrance of the OK Corral. The four men, Wyatt, Virgil, Morgan, and John Henry, met near Hafford's Corner shortly after 1 o'clock in the afternoon. The plan was simple: disarm the cowboys or arrest them. Virgil, as the chief law enforcement officer, held the authority. He looked at John Henry. The dentist was pale, his eyes bright with a feverish intensity. He was not a deputy in the official sense, but he was a necessary instrument of violence. Virgil held a short-barreled 10-gauge double-barreled shotgun, a Wells Fargo street howitzer designed to clear a deck in a single pull. He did not want to carry it. It was too conspicuous, and Virgil wanted to appear as if he were making an arrest, not leading a firing squad. He handed the heavy weapon to Holliday. John Henry took the shotgun. It was heavy, a solid mass of steel and wood. He checked the hammers. He checked the caps. He slid the weapon under his long gray coat. The ulster swallowed the gun completely. In exchange, he handed Virgil his walking stick, a sturdy cane he used when the rheumatism in his legs flared up. It was a symbolic trade. The lawman took the cane, the killer took the cannon. John Henry adjusted the coat, feeling the cold steel of the shotgun, barrel resting against his hip. He smiled, a thin, humorless curving of his lips beneath his mustache. This was the work he was born for. They began the walk. 4 men in black and gray coats walking 4 abreast down the center of the dusty street. The wind kicked up grit, stinging their faces. The town went silent as they passed. Shopkeepers locked their doors, pedestrians scrambled into alleys. It was a funeral procession for men who were not yet dead. John Henry walked on the outside nearest the buildings. He whistled softly, a tuneless melody that was lost in the wind. He felt a profound sense of calm. The waiting was over. The gambling table was closed. The wheel was about to spin one last time. They turned onto Fremont Street. Ahead in the vacant lot between Fly's photography studio and the Harwood house, the cowboys were waiting. There were 5 of them initially. Ike Clanton, Billy Clanton, Frank McClory, Tom McClory, and Billy Claiborne. They were standing by their horses, a knot of dark hats and dusters. Sheriff Johnny Bean, the corrupt county officer who played both sides, rushed out to intercept the Earps. He waved his hands, claiming he had already disarmed the cowboys. It was a lie, or at least a gross exaggeration. Wyatt brushed past him, his eyes fixed on the men in the lot. John Henry ignored the sheriff entirely. Bean was a ghost, a non-entity. The only reality was the group of men standing 15 yards away. The distance closed. The Earps and Holliday spread out as they approached the lot. They were now less than 6 feet from the cowboys. The space between them was charged with an electric lethal potential. The cowboys looked tense, their hands hovering near their waistbands. Frank McClory, a hard man with a reputation for accuracy, stood by his horse, his eyes locked on Wyatt. Billy Clanton, just 19 years old but eager to prove his manhood, stood with his hand on his revolver. Tom McClory, ostensibly unarmed but standing near a rifle in a saddle scabbard, looked nervous. Ike Clanton, the loudmouth who had started it all, looked terrified. "Throw up your hands!" Virgil shouted. His voice was a command, authoritative and loud. "I want your guns!" The reaction was instantaneous. There was no slow-motion draw, no cinematic pause. Frank McClory and Billy Clanton reached for their revolvers. Wyatt Earp did not reach for his hands, he drew his pistol. The air shattered. 2 shots rang out almost simultaneously, merging into a single deafening roar. Wyatt's bullet struck Frank McClory in the stomach. Frank bent over, clutching his gut, his pistol discharging into the dirt. Billy Clanton fired at Wyatt but missed, the slug tearing through the coat of the marshal. The fight exploded into general carnage. Smoke filled the narrow space between the buildings instantly, a blinding, choking white cloud of black powder residue. The noise was apocalyptic, the boom of heavy-caliber revolvers echoing off the wooden walls of the studio and the adobe of the house. John Henry moved. He did not stand still. He stepped to the side, flanking the group. Ike Clanton, realizing that his bluff had been called in the most horrific manner possible, ran forward. He grabbed Wyatt's arm, screaming that he was unarmed. Wyatt shoved him away, telling him to fight or get out. Ike scrambled past them, running into the photography studio, leaving his brother and friends to die. Billy Claiborne ran as well, vanishing into the smoke. That left 3 cowboys: Frank, Billy, and Tom. Frank was gut-shot but still standing, stumbling into the street, trying to use his horse for cover. Billy Clanton was firing wildly, taking a bullet in the wrist and another in the chest, collapsing against the corner of the Harwood house. Tom McClory was the problem. He was standing behind a horse, reaching for the rifle in the scabbard, or perhaps a pistol concealed in his waistband. He was using the animal as a shield, trying to get a clear line of fire on the lawman. John Henry saw him. The dentist moved around the horse, closing the distance until he was less than 10 feet from Tom McClory. He swept the long gray coat back, revealing the twin barrels of the 10-gauge shotgun. It was a terrifying reveal, like a magician producing a dragon. Tom looked up, his eyes widening as he saw the black circles of the muzzle. There was no time to beg, there was no time to run. John Henry pulled the trigger. The shotgun roared. It was a sound distinct from the crack of the pistols, a deep thudding boom that shook the ground. The load of double-aught buckshot left the barrel in a spreading cloud of hot metal. At that range, the spread was minimal. The entire charge, roughly a dozen heavy pellets, slammed into Tom McClory's right side, just under the armpit. The effect was catastrophic. The buckshot did not just penetrate, it shredded. It tore through the ribs, pulping the lungs and severing the major arteries near the heart. The force of the impact lifted Tom off his feet and spun him around. A spray of bright arterial blood and shredded fabric painted the air. He did not scream. The air had been driven from his body along with his life. He collapsed into the dust, a ruined heap of flesh and clothing, dying before he hit the ground. John Henry did not pause to admire his handiwork. The recoil of the shotgun had jarred his shoulder, but he flowed with the motion. He tossed the empty shotgun aside. It clattered into the dirt. In the same motion, he drew the nickel-plated revolver from under his coat. He turned toward the street. Frank McClory was there, holding his stomach with one hand and his pistol with the other. Frank was dying, but he was a game fighter. He saw Holliday, the man who had just obliterated his brother. Frank raised his gun, steadying it despite the agony in his gut. "I've got you now," Frank snarled, blood flecking his lips. "You're a daisy if you do," John Henry replied. His voice was calm, almost cheerful. Frank fired. The bullet struck John Henry in the hip. It grazed the skin, cutting a deep furrow across his lower back and smashing into the leather of his holster. The impact spun John Henry slightly, a sharp, burning sting that felt like a hot branding iron. He stumbled but did not fall. He righted himself, ignoring the pain. At the same moment, Morgan Earp, who had been shot through the shoulders and was lying on the ground, raised his own pistol. John Henry and Morgan fired at Frank McClory simultaneously. It was a crossfire execution. One bullet struck Frank behind the ear, shattering the base of his skull. The other struck him in the chest. Frank's body went rigid. The light went out of his eyes instantly. He fell face forward into the dirt of Fremont Street, dead alongside his brother. To the side, Billy Clanton was still fighting. He was sitting on the ground, his back against the wall of the Harwood house. He had been hit multiple times. His right wrist was shattered. He was switching his pistol to his left hand, trying to cock the hammer against his leg. He was 19 years old, and he was drowning in his own blood. "Drive the crowd away," he screamed, delirious with pain. Virgil and Wyatt turned toward him. The threat had to be neutralized. They fired. Billy jerked as the bullet struck him. He slumped over, his gun slipping from his fingers. Then, silence. It descended as quickly as the noise had begun. The whole affair had lasted less than 30 seconds. 30 seconds of concentrated fury that had burned itself out. The smoke hung low in the alley, a thick, sulphurous fog that obscured the sun. John Henry stood in the middle of the street. He looked down at his hip. There was blood soaking into his trousers, but the leg would hold. He looked at the bodies. Tom McClory was a shredded mess of buckshot wounds. Frank McClory was lying in a pool of blood that was expanding rapidly in the dust. Billy Clanton was gasping, his last breaths against the wall, calling for his mother. Sheriff Behan stood frozen near the photography studio, his face the color of ash. He had watched the slaughter and done nothing. Wyatt Earp stood unharmed, the only one of the 4 defenders who had not been touched by a bullet. Virgil was bleeding from a wound in his calf. Morgan was groaning, the bullet having passed through his back and shoulder blades. John Henry walked over to Frank McClory's body. He nudged it with his boot. There was no movement. He holstered his nickel-plated pistol. "They got me," Virgil said, his voice tight with pain. "I'm hit too," Morgan gasped. John Henry looked at them. "I'm shot right through," he said, checking his side. He realized then that the bullet had not penetrated the visceral cavity. It was a flesh wound, a painful one, but not fatal. He felt a strange disappointment. He had walked into the fire hoping to burn, but he had only been singed. The tuberculosis was still there, rattling in his chest, denied its victory by the bullet. The townspeople began to emerge from their hiding places. They gathered at the edges of the lot, staring in horror at the carnage. 3 men lay dead or dying. 3 lawmen were wounded. The smell of blood mixed with the gunpowder, creating a copper tang stench that coated the back of the throat. John Henry pulled his coat tighter around himself. The adrenaline was fading and the cold wind was returning. He felt the familiar exhaustion settling into his bones. They began to move the wounded. A wagon was brought for Morgan and Virgil. John Henry refused help. He walked back toward the hotel, limping slightly. He passed the gathered crowd, his face a mask of indifference. He heard them whispering. They looked at him with a new kind of fear. He was no longer just the gambler. He was the reaper. He had used a shotgun on a man at point-blank range. He had turned the street into a slaughterhouse. He reached his room and sat on the edge of the bed. He took off his coat. He examined the wound on his hip. It was ugly, raw, and bleeding, but it would heal. He poured a glass of whiskey, his hand steady. He drank it down, feeling the warmth spread through his chest. He thought about Tom McClory's face in that split second before the shotgun fired. He thought about the spray of blood. He felt no guilt. They had come looking for a fight. They had found it. The aftermath would be messy. There would be inquests, trials, and more violence. The cowboys would not forgive this. The war was not over. It had just escalated from a skirmish to a blood feud. But for now, John Henry Holliday sat in the silence of his room. Listening to the wind howl outside, he was alive. He had stood in the storm of metal and walked away. He poured another drink. The judgment at the Corral had been delivered. The verdict was death. And John Henry was the executioner, March 18th, 1882. The night air in Tombstone, Arizona was cold and still, masking the violence that waited in the darkness of the alleyway behind Campbell and Hatch's saloon and billiard parlor. Inside the establishment, the gas lamps cast a warm yellow glow over the green felt of the pool tables. Morgan Earp, the youngest and most spirited of the brothers, leaned over the table, lining up a shot. He was 29 years old, vibrant and confident, believing that the recent acquittals and the veneer of law and order would protect him. John Henry Holliday stood nearby, watching the game with a detached interest, his hand resting near the revolver beneath his coat. The feud with the cowboys had not ended at the OK Corral. It had merely gone underground, festering in the shadows of the Dragoon Mountains and the back rooms of Charleston. The threats had been constant, but the Earp faction had refused to be cowed, continuing to walk the streets with a defiance that enraged their enemies. The crack of the gunshot shattered the illusion of safety along with the window pane of the back door. A .45 caliber slug tore through the glass, bypassing the wooden frame, and struck Morgan in the back. The bullet entered just to the left of his spine, smashing through a vertebra, pulverizing his internal organs, and exiting through his abdomen to lodge in the thigh of a bystander named George Berry. Morgan collapsed instantly, his cue stick clattering to the floor. A second shot followed, lodging in the wall near Wyatt's head, narrowly missing the elder Earp. John Henry drew his weapon instantly, rushing toward the back door. But the assassins had already vanished into the blackness of the night, leaving only the smell of burnt gunpowder and the echoes of their cowardice. They carried Morgan into the card room and laid him on a lounge. The doctors arrived quickly, but a cursory examination revealed the catastrophic nature of the wound. The spinal cord was severed. The liver was shattered. There was nothing to be done but administer opiates and wait for the end. John Henry stood by the wall, his face a mask of stone, watching the life bleed out of the only man who could match his own reckless humor. Morgan remained conscious for nearly an hour, whispering final words to his brothers before the light faded from his eyes. The death of Morgan Earp broke something fundamental in the dynamic of the group. The law, which they had tried to uphold, had failed them completely. The courts had released the cowboys, and now the cowboys were conducting assassinations. Wyatt stood up from his brother's body, his face drained of color but filled with a terrifying resolve. The badge was no longer a shield. It was a target. He took it off. The time for arrests was over. March 20th, 1882. The surviving Earp party prepared to move. Virgil Earp, who had been maimed in an ambush months earlier and now possessed a useless left arm, needed to be transported to safety in California along with the women of the family. They knew the cowboys would try to finish the job before the train left the territory. John Henry, Wyatt, Warren Earp, Sherman McMasters, and Turkey Creek Jack Johnson formed a heavily armed phalanx around the cripple and the mourners. They boarded the train in Contention City, riding with shotguns across their laps, eyes scanning the horizon for any sign of an ambush. They arrived in Tucson in the evening, the train hissing steam as it pulled into the station. The night was dark, the moon obscured by clouds, creating a landscape of deep shadows and uncertain shapes. While the passengers disembarked for dinner, the Earp Guard remained vigilant. They scanned the platform, looking for the familiar faces of their enemies. They found them. Ike Clanton and Frank Stillwell were lurking in the shadows of the depot, watching the train cars with predatory intent. Stillwell, a known stage robber and suspected participant in Morgan's murder, was armed and waiting. He saw the Earp party and realized the element of surprise was lost. He turned and ran, heading down the tracks into the darkness of the train yard. Wyatt did not shout a warning. He did not call for surrender. He simply broke into a run, his shotgun in his hands. John Henry was right beside him, his long coat flapping in the wind, his breath coming in ragged gasps as he forced his failing lungs to keep pace. They caught Frank Stillwell near the flat cars, a few hundred yards from the station. Stillwell saw them coming and stopped, perhaps realizing he could not outrun the fury descending upon him. He may have tried to surrender, or he may have tried to draw. It made no difference. Wyatt arrived first. The double-barreled shotgun roared at close range. The blast of buckshot struck Stillwell in the midsection, nearly cutting him in half. The impact threw him backward onto the gravel of the roadbed, but one death was not enough to satisfy the rage that consumed them. John Henry arrived a second later. He stood over the fallen, ruined man and opened fire with his revolver. Wyatt drew his revolver and joined in. They fired round after round into the body, bullets tearing into the chest, the arms, the legs. It was a frenzied, ritualistic slaughter, a message written in blood and ballistics. When the smoke cleared, Frank Stillwell was unrecognizable, riddled with buckshot and pistol slugs. They left him lying in the cinders, a gruesome warning to anyone who thought they could kill an Earp and live. The killing of Stillwell marked the official beginning of the vendetta ride. They were no longer lawmen acting within the gray areas of their authority. They were federal fugitives wanted for murder in Pima County. They put Virgil and the women on the train to California, watching the taillights fade into the west. Then they turned back toward Tombstone. They were not running away. They were going back into the heart of the enemy's territory to finish the list. They rode hard through the night, the horses foaming, the men silent. John Henry felt a grim satisfaction. The legal constraints were gone. The pretense of civilization had been stripped away. They were a death squad, pure and simple. They arrived back in Tombstone only long enough to gather supplies and fresh mounts. Sheriff Johnny Bean, armed with a warrant for their arrest, tried to approach them. The posse ignored him, brushing past the ineffectual lawman with contempt. They rode out of town, heading for the Dragoon Mountains, the stronghold of the cowboy faction. The landscape was brutal. Jagged peaks, box canyons, and endless miles of scrub brush that offered 1,000 places for an ambush. They slept on the ground, wrapped in blankets, shivering in the high desert cold. John Henry coughed into the darkness, the sound muffled by his coat. His body was failing him. The riding was agony for his joints, and the dust was torture for his lungs. But his will was iron. He strapped himself into the saddle each morning, fueled by whiskey and hate. March 22nd, 1882. The posse tracked a man named Florentino Cruz, also known as Indian Charlie, to a wood camp in the South Pass of the Dragoons. Cruz had been identified as the lookout during the assassination of Morgan. They found him working, unaware that his judgment day had arrived. They surrounded the camp, weapons drawn. Cruz saw the grim faces of the riders and knew his time was short. He tried to run, but a warning shot kicked up the dust at his feet. He stopped, trembling, his hands in the air. They dragged him to a clearing. The interrogation was brief and terrifying. Wyatt asked him if he was there when Morgan was killed. Cruz, terrified and hoping for mercy, admitted he was holding the horses for the shooters. He named the men: Stillwell, Ringo, Curly Bill Brocious. He thought the confession would buy him a jail cell. He was wrong. It bought him a bullet. The posse did not have handcuffs, and they had no intention of taking prisoners back to a corrupt court system. Wyatt looked at the man who had helped murder his brother. He raised his revolver. John Henry and the others did the same. They fired in unison. Florentino Cruz collapsed, his body riddled with bullets. They left him where he fell. Another name crossed off the list. The ride continued. They moved through the mountains like ghosts, striking fear into the isolated ranches that supported the cowboys. The network of rustlers and thieves that had operated with impunity for years was suddenly being hunted. John Henry rode with a shotgun resting across his saddle horn. He was the embodiment of the angel of death, a pale, gaunt figure who brought destruction to the wicked. They stopped at a ranch owned by Pete Spence, another suspect. Spence was not there, but they terrorized his workers, sending a clear message that no sanctuary was safe. The physical toll was immense. They were low on food, drinking bad water, and constantly looking over their shoulders for the sheriff's posse that was half-heartedly pursuing them. March 24th, 1882. The heat was oppressive as they rode toward Iron Springs in the Whetstone Mountains. They were looking for water and a place to rest. The springs were located in a depression, surrounded by cottonwood trees and heavy brush. As they approached, they were unaware that the main body of the cowboy leadership was camped there waiting for them. Curly Bill Brocious, the de facto leader of the outlaws, was cooking a meal by the fire. He had 8 men with him, all heavily armed. Wyatt Earp and John Henry Holliday were riding in the vanguard. As they came over the lip of the embankment, they stumbled directly into the camp. The surprise was absolute on both sides. The cowboys scrambled for their weapons. Curly Bill grabbed a shotgun and leveled it at Wyatt. He fired the buckshot, tearing through the coat of the marshal but miraculously missing his flesh. Wyatt dismounted in a fluid motion, his own shotgun coming up. He fired both barrels at Brocious. The heavy charge struck the outlaw leader in the chest, killing him instantly. Curly Bill fell into the spring, the water turning red with his blood. The firefight that followed was intense and chaotic. The cowboys, recovering from the shock, opened up with a withering volley of rifle fire. Wyatt was caught in the open, the bullets kicking up dust around his boots and snapping through the air near his ears. He tried to mount his horse, but the animal was panicked by the gunfire. John Henry, realizing the danger, laid down a covering fire with his shotgun and revolver. He moved with a reckless disregard for his own safety, drawing the attention of the shooters. "Get back!" he shouted, his voice cracking. The other members of the posse, McMasters, Johnson, and Vermillion, had retreated to the cover of the rocks when the shooting started. Wyatt was alone in the kill zone. He finally managed to mount his horse, but the saddle cinch was loose. He had to ride bareback, holding on by the mane while returning fire with his pistol. He struck another cowboy, Johnny Barnes, in the chest. The outlaws, demoralized by the death of their leader and the supernatural luck of Wyatt Earp, broke and ran. They retreated into the brush, firing blindly as they went. John Henry covered Wyatt's retreat, firing his empty shotgun and then switching to his nickel-plated Colt. He sent round after round into the cottonwoods, keeping the cowboys pinned down until the marshal was clear. They regrouped on the ridge, breathing hard, checking for wounds. Miraculously, none of the posse had been hit. Wyatt's coat was shredded, his saddle horn was shot off, and his boot heel was missing, but his skin was unbroken. They looked down at the spring. Curly Bill was dead. The head of the snake had been cut off. The victory at Iron Springs was the climax of the ride, but it also marked the turning point. They were out of ammunition, out of food, and their horses were exhausted. Sheriff Bean's posse, which numbered nearly 30 men, was closing in. The cowboy faction was in disarray, but they still had the numbers and the home terrain. Wyatt made the decision to withdraw. They could not fight the entire territory forever. They turned their horses north toward Colorado. The journey north was a grueling test of endurance. They rode through the high country, avoiding the towns and the main roads. The snow was deep in the passes, chilling them to the bone. John Henry suffered terribly. The altitude and the cold ravaged his lungs. He coughed constantly, his body racked with spasms that threatened to unseat him. He tied himself to the saddle, refusing to stop, refusing to be a burden. He drank the last of the whiskey, forcing himself to keep moving. He looked at Wyatt, who rode with a grim silence, and knew that they had done what they set out to do. They had balanced the scales. They reached Silver City, New Mexico in early April, selling their horses and taking the stagecoach to Deming, then the train to Albuquerque. The vendetta was effectively over. They had killed 4 men in 17 days. They had shattered the power of the cowboys. But they had also destroyed their own lives in Arizona. They could never go back. They were exiles, marked men who would spend the rest of their days looking over their shoulders. In Albuquerque, the tension remained high. The Earp party stayed in a fortified position, fearing that the cowboys or the law would catch up to them. But the fight had gone out of their pursuers. Bean did not have the stomach to follow them into another territory. The cowboys were leaderless and scattered. John Henry sat in a saloon in Albuquerque cleaning his gun. He looked at the reflection in the polished metal. He looked older, more wasted. The fire that had burned during the ride was beginning to dim, replaced by the cold ash of his illness. They moved on to Colorado, seeking the safety of a state that would refuse extradition. They arrived in Trinidad, then Pueblo, and finally Gunnison. The group began to drift apart. The singular purpose that had united them, revenge, was gone. They were just men again, dealing with the trauma and the uncertainty of the future. John Henry said his goodbyes to the others. He watched McMasters and Johnson ride off to new lives. He stayed with Wyatt for a time, but even that bond was changing. The war was over, and soldiers without a war are difficult company. John Henry Holliday settled into a hotel room in Pueblo, staring at the mountains. He was 30 years old. He had survived the shootouts, the lynch mobs, and the vendetta ride. He had killed men who deserved it and perhaps some who didn't. He had ridden through hell and come out the other side. But the one enemy he could not outride was waiting for him. He felt the familiar tickle in his throat, the deep rattling weight in his chest. He poured a glass of whiskey and toasted the empty room. To Morgan, to the ride, to the end. The guns were holstered, but the dying continued. The final chapter was waiting, not in a street fight, but in a bed. May 1st, 1884. The thin air of Leadville, Colorado did not sustain life so much as it preserved it in a state of frozen suspension. At 10,000 feet above sea level, the oxygen was scarce, forcing the lungs to work double time to extract what little sustenance existed in the atmosphere. For a man with the respiratory capacity of John Henry Holliday, the town was an open-air torture chamber. He had drifted here after the dissolution of the Vendetta gang, separating from Wyatt Earp in a final quiet parting of ways in Gunnison. There were no dramatic farewells, only the recognition that their wars were fought on different battlefields now. Wyatt had moved on to new schemes and new towns, seeking fortune. John Henry had moved to Leadville not to live, but to oversee the slow, final liquidation of his own existence. He walked the icy streets of Harrison Avenue, a gaunt specter wrapped in a heavy buffalo coat, his breath steaming in the frigid air like the exhaust of a failing engine. Leadville was a rough, ugly stain on the pristine white of the Rockies, a place where silver barons built ice palaces and miners froze to death in snowdrifts mere yards from the saloons. It was a town of stark contrasts, of immense wealth and grinding poverty, and John Henry sat firmly at the bottom of the pile. The reputation he had carved out in Tombstone, the fear he had commanded as the executioner of the cowboys, held little currency here. To the miners of Leadville, he was just another sick gambler, a lunger with a bad temper and a worse cough. The consumption had ravaged him completely. He weighed less than 130 pounds. His hair was completely gray and his skin had taken on the translucent, parchment-like quality of the very old. He needed a cane to walk, not for affectation, but because his legs trembled with a weakness that no amount of whiskey could mask. He found work dealing faro at the Monarch Saloon and later at Hyman's Saloon. The stakes were lower than in the glory days of Dodge or Tombstone. He dealt to men who smelled of wet wool and blasting powder. His hands moving with a mechanical slowness, the dexterous fingers that could once manipulate a deck with magician-like speed were now stiff and swollen. He relied heavily on laudanum to sleep and whiskey to wake, creating a chemical equilibrium that allowed him to function for a few hours at a time. The pain in his chest was a constant companion, a dull ache that flared into sharp, stabbing agony with every cough. He was dying, and everyone knew it. The vultures were beginning to circle, sensing that the predator was toothless. One such vulture was a man named Billy Allen. Allen was a bartender and a small-time tough who had known Holliday in Tombstone. He was a large man, a bully who specialized in intimidating those weaker than himself. In Leadville, the dynamic between them had shifted. In Arizona, Allen would have crossed the street to avoid John Henry. In Colorado, seeing the dentist leaning on his cane, coughing into a blood-spotted handkerchief, Allen saw a victim. The dispute was trivial, as most fatal disputes are. It concerned $5. John Henry had borrowed the sum from Allen, a pittance, but in his destitute state he could not immediately repay it. Allen began to press him. He publicly humiliated the gambler, demanding the money in loud, aggressive tones. He threatened to beat John Henry, to knock his block off if the debt was not settled. August 19, 1884. The ultimatum had been delivered. Allen had told anyone who would listen that he intended to hunt Holliday down and beat the money out of him. John Henry sat in Hyman's saloon, nursing a drink he could barely swallow. He knew he could not win a fist fight. A single solid punch from a man of Allen's size would likely kill him, shattering his brittle ribs and collapsing his remaining lung tissue. He was cornered. The fear he felt was not of death. He had courted death for a decade, but of the indignity of being beaten like a dog in the street. He had lived by the gun, and he determined that if he was to go down, he would go down holding one. He sent a friend to his room to retrieve his revolver and place the heavy iron beneath the counter near his cigar box. He waited. Around 5 o'clock in the afternoon, Billy Allen entered Hyman's saloon. He came through the door with the swagger of a man expecting to dispense punishment. He saw Holliday standing near the cigar case. Allen's hand dropped to his pocket, suggesting he might be reaching for a weapon, or perhaps just brass knuckles. He advanced on the dentist. John Henry did not wait for the assault. He reached over the counter and grabbed his revolver. It was heavy in his wasted hand. He leveled it at the approaching mass of Billy Allen. He did not aim for the head or the heart. He simply pointed and pulled the trigger. The shot cracked through the saloon, but the result was pathetic compared to the surgical precision of the OK Corral. The bullet missed Allen's vital organs entirely, striking the door frame and ricocheting, or perhaps grazing his arm. Allen paused, stunned that the skeleton had actually fired. John Henry cocked the weapon again, his hand shaking violently. He fired a second time. This bullet struck Allen, but it hit him in the fleshy part of the arm, near the wrist. It was a wound that would barely slow a determined man. Allen lunged forward, but he did not reach the gunman. The bystanders, realizing that a murder was being attempted in slow motion, tackled Allen. Simultaneously, the saloon owner grabbed Holliday, wresting the gun from his feeble grip. The shooting of Billy Allen was a tragedy of incompetence. It marked the definitive end of Doc Holliday, the gunman. He had shot an unarmed man over $5 and failed to kill him at a range of 10 feet. He was arrested and hauled off to the Leadville jail. The cell was cold, damp, and filthy. John Henry collapsed on the cot, his body racked with coughing fits that brought up pints of blood. He expected to die there, awaiting trial. But a strange thing happened. The town of Leadville, which had scorned him, took pity on him. They saw the shooting not as an act of aggression, but as the desperate last stand of a dying man against a bully. Public sentiment turned in his favor. He remained in jail for days, his health deteriorating rapidly. When the trial finally came, the jury looked at the frail defendant, wrapped in blankets, barely able to lift his head, and then at the hulking Billy Allen. The verdict was acquittal. They judged that he had acted in self-defense, or perhaps they simply decided that hanging a man who was going to be dead in a month anyway was a waste of rope. John Henry was released. He walked out of the courthouse a free man, but his reputation as a bad man was gone. He was just a sick old man who had gotten lucky. The winter of 1885 was brutal. John Henry survived it by staying indoors, huddled next to wood stoves, living on a diet of whiskey and milk. He realized he could not stay in Leadville. The altitude was finishing the job the bacteria had started. He needed lower ground. He moved to Denver for a time, but the city was too large, too anonymous, and the air was filled with coal smoke. He heard rumors of a place in the mountains to the west, a town called Glenwood Springs. They said it had sulfur springs, hot waters that bubbled up from the earth with miraculous healing properties. It was the last hope of the desperate. May 1887. John Henry arrived in Glenwood Springs. The town was nestled in a narrow valley carved by the Grand River, surrounded by red sandstone cliffs. The air smelled constantly of rotten eggs, the telltale odor of the sulfur springs. For John Henry, it smelled like hope. He checked into the Hotel Glenwood, a brick structure that promised comfort and care for invalids. He took a room on the ground floor initially, then moved as his condition fluctuated. He spent his savings on the waters, soaking his wasted body in the hot, stinking pools, inhaling the steam. He hoped the sulfur would burn the rot out of his lungs. It did not work. The tuberculosis was too advanced. The caverns in his lungs were massive, filled with infection that no water could reach. The steam only seemed to loosen the fluid, making his cough wetter and more productive. He spent his days sitting on the veranda of the hotel, a blanket over his knees, watching the healthy people walk by. He dealt faro occasionally at the local gambling halls when he had the strength, playing against himself mostly, turning the cards with a slow, meditative rhythm. He was 35 years old, but he looked 70. The locals called him the Doc, treating him with a gentle deference reserved for the terminally ill. By September 1887, he was bedridden. He could no longer walk to the springs. The world shrank to the four walls of his hotel room. The wallpaper, a floral pattern, became his entire landscape. He lay in the bed, propped up by pillows, fighting for every single breath. The act of breathing became his full-time occupation. Inhale, rattling wheeze, pain, exhale, repeat. He kept a bottle of whiskey on the nightstand, taking sips to dull the edges of the agony. The bellboy, a young man who ran errands for him, brought him the papers and fresh water. John Henry tipped him generously, knowing he couldn't take the money with him. October 1887. The end was close. He drifted in and out of delirium. In his fever dreams, he was back in Georgia, smelling the pine woods. He was in Dallas, feeling the heat. He was in the OK Corral, hearing the boom of the shotgun. The faces of the dead visited him: Mike Gordon, Tom McClory, Frank Stillwell. They did not accuse him, they simply waited. He woke from these dreams sweating and gasping, clutching the sheets with claw-like hands. He looked at his feet sticking out from under the blanket. They were pale, bony, and useless. November 7th, 1887. John Henry woke with a clarity that often precedes death. The fever had receded slightly, leaving him weak but lucid. He asked the nurse for a glass of whiskey. She hesitated, then poured him a generous measure. What harm could it do now? He took the glass in his trembling hand. He looked at the amber liquid, the only friend that had never betrayed him. He drank it down, feeling the familiar burn one last time. It settled in his stomach, a warm ember in a cooling ash pit. He looked down at his body. He was lying in a soft bed between clean white sheets. A fire crackled in the grate, casting a warm glow on the room. It was a scene of domestic comfort, of peace, and that was the joke. For 15 years, John Henry Holliday had chased a violent death. He had walked into gunfire, provoked knife fights, and ridden on vendettas, fully expecting, and perhaps hoping, to die in the dust with his boots on. He had wagered his life on a violent end, believing that a bullet was the only honorable exit for a man of his profession. He looked at his bare feet. No boots, no spurs, just skin and bone against cotton sheets. He was dying like a shopkeeper. He was dying like the gentleman dentist he had tried so hard to erase. The irony was absolute. The universe had denied him the gunman's death and forced him to endure the slow, quiet, respectable end he had run from since Georgia. A smile touched his lips, a genuine expression of amusement at the absurdity of fate. "This is funny," he whispered. They were his final words. The glass slipped from his fingers to the rug. His eyes remained open, staring at his bare feet, fixed on the punchline of the great cosmic joke. The breathing stopped. The rattling ceased. John Henry Holliday was dead. It was 10 o'clock in the morning on November 8th, 1887. The funeral was a quiet affair. There were no mourners from his past. Wyatt Earp was in California. Big Nose Kate was drifting somewhere in the wind. The only people who stood by the grave were the few acquaintances he had made in Glenwood Springs and the hotel staff. They buried him in the Linwood Cemetery on a hill overlooking the town. The ground was frozen hard, requiring pickaxes to break the earth. They lowered the simple wooden coffin into the hole. There was no 21-gun salute. There was no eulogy praising his deadly aim or his loyalty to the Earps. There was just the sound of dirt hitting wood, a hollow thud that marked the final closure of the account. The snow began to fall as the gravediggers filled the pit, covering the fresh mound with a blanket of white. The wind howled through the red rocks of the canyon, a lonely, high-pitched sound that echoed the emptiness of the gambler's life. John Henry Holliday had left nothing behind but a trail of bodies, a legend of fearlessness, and a few dollars in a hotel nightstand. The West moved on without him. The railroads were built, the mines were played out, and the open range was fenced. The era of the gunman was dying just as surely as he had. But in the silence of the cemetery under the gray winter sky, the legend began to take root. The man was gone, returned to the dust. But the story of the dentist who laughed at death remained, frozen in time like the town that killed him. The wager was settled. The house had won.